Chapter 23. The black-clothed old man stopped and turned around to look at Jingjio. A surprised expression appeared on his face as he said, "I haven't used it for a long time, so I'm not sure." Jingjio said, "How about I give it a try?" Upon hearing this, Lin Wuji's expression changed slightly, and those Yunqing Peak deacons and disciples also turned to look at him. The old man in black looked at him and was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Fine, let's see what you can do." Then, he continued to walk towards the sword peak. Lin Wuji glanced at Jingjio, and the disciples also felt strange. Just now, when that martial uncle asked a question, you didn't answer. Now that martial uncle is about to leave, you want to say something like this. What do you mean? The old man in black raised his head and looked at the sword peak in the clouds. A sword chime rang out. The sword light illuminated the cliff at the foot of the peak. The old man in black rode on his sword and flew up along with the wind. His body was no longer hunched. It was extremely straight, just like the young man who had just entered the Aoyama sect. A moment later, his figure disappeared into the clouds and could no longer be seen. Countless sword cries resounded in the mountains. The disciples did not know what was going on, but they were shocked speechless. The deacons of Yunqing Peak sang, "Martial Uncle Mo's sword returns to Aoyama." The disciples of Aoyama all responded, "Congratulations to Elder Mo for returning the sword to Aoyama." The sound of a sword rang out from Tianguang Peak. The ancient bell of Shanda Peak rang. On Qingrong Peak, the white clouds covered the sky. Senior Master Mo has been organizing the books on Shuriwa Peak for more than 100 years. Today, looking at the sword peak, Lin Wuji didn't finish his sentence. His eyes were a little wet. It was said that cultivators must cut off their emotions, but how many of them could do that? Moreover, Aoyama sect did not cultivate the Tao, but the sword. As a swordsman, how could he not be sad if he could not meet again in the future? Only then did the disciples realize what had happened. That martial Uncle Mo, who had been talking to them warmly, had actually passed away. The only reason he came to Sword Peak was to return his sword to Aoyama. He hoped that one of his future disciples would be able to inherit his sword. Looking at the sword peak, the disciples felt that there were some inexplicable feelings in their hearts. It was a little heavy. Perhaps this was the first lesson in Aoyama. They turned to look at Jingjio. What did Jingjio mean when he told Uncle Mo that he knew how to use his sword? Is that what it means? Lin Wuji looked at Jingjio and said, "I don't know how you guessed that martial Uncle Mo was going to return his sword to Aoyama. I also don't know if you said those words to comfort him or to please him and let him put his sword in a lower place. I just want to tell you that you have aroused Senior Brother Mo's last bit of pride. The position of that sword is very close to the mountain peak." "So?" Jingjio asked. Lin Wuji stared into his eyes and said, "Since you promised, you must do it. Otherwise, I won't let you participate in the inherited sword competition no matter which peak you're from." Hearing this, the disciples were all surprised, looking at Jingjio with sympathy in their eyes. The sword peak was full of formidable sword wills, and the higher they went, the thicker the sword wills were. The peak top was deep in the clouds. How could they get there with their current cultivation states? It's not good to talk too much, be sentimental, and meddlesome. Having said that, Lin Wuji rode his sword and left. This remark was also directed at Jingjio, referring to his behavior before Uncle Mo's death on Shuriwa Peak. By now, the disciples realized that Lin Wuji didn't really hate Jingjio, but rather thought highly of him. A caretaker of Yunqing Peak distributed the sword board to a dozen disciples and said, "There are swords left by the previous masters on the sword peak, so you have to pay attention to your manners when searching for them and avoid running around noisily. Of course, there are many ownerless swords here. No matter what sword you find, as long as it can respond to your call, it's a success. If you get lost, hurt, or have any accidents, you just need to crush this sword board, and someone will take care of it." Looking at the cliff walls, a disciple asked, "That's it?" After training their bodies in the outer sect, the inner sect disciples' bodies were much stronger than those of ordinary people. They could easily jump a distance of dozens of feet, and their endurance was also very long. He thought that even though the sword peak was steep, he could always climb it. Even though the sword wheels were strong, he could still rely on his willpower. As long as he didn't enter the area covered by the clouds, he was confident that he could go up and down freely. The caretaker of Yunqing Peak didn't say anything. He looked at that disciple, the corners of his mouth curling up, revealing an unfathomable smile. The disciples who could enter the inner sect were all very smart young men, so they understood the meaning of the smile. That disciple's face was slightly pale. He bowed and said, "Please give us some advice, big brother." The caretakers of the outer sect of Oyama's sect were the disciples who couldn't break through the state of spiritual stability, and the caretakers of the inner sect among the 9 peaks were the disciples who couldn't be selected in the inherited sword competition. So it was reasonable for him to call them big brother. You're still in the state of spiritual stability, so you have no hope of finding the swords. You should enter the state of understanding first. The caretaker of Yunqing Peak said, "Even if you can find the swords, will the swords follow you? Why are there so many infatuated men and resentful women in the mortal world?" A disciple asked, "How long will it take for us to get the swords?" It takes an average of 3 years for an ordinary disciple to have their own flying swords. Those who are talented and lucky might be able to get them faster. The caretaker of Yunqing Peak pointed at the sword in the cloud and said, "Sister Zhao took 3 months. Think about how long it will take you." After saying this, he went back to the small building at the bottom of the peak, leaving the dozen or so young disciples there. The dozen or so young disciples looked at each other speechlessly, wondering what to do next. Zhao Liu was the most talented figure among the disciples of the second generation, and she was the idol of these new disciples. It took her 3 months to achieve the same result, let alone the rest of them. Moreover, the caretaker had made it very clear that it was meaningless for them to enter the Sword Peak with their current state of spiritual stability. Since this is the first lesson given by the sect, we can't just let it go. A disciple surnamed Zhu showed a determined expression, looked at the crowd, and said in a deep voice, "Even if we can't sense where the swords are, we can go to the Sword Peak first to familiarize ourselves with the environment and prepare for the future." That's right. The caretaker of Yunqing Peak gave us the sword token. A female disciple nodded and said, "Master Lin said that the Sword Peak can train one's mind. Maybe he or other masters are secretly watching us. How can we not go?" The disciples were convinced by these 2 sentences, and one by one they shouted to go with them. They looked very excited. Jingjiu didn't say anything. He just stood there quietly, which was a bit conspicuous. Many eyes fell on him at the same time. The disciples knew that he was famous for his laziness, but they thought that since he was able to enter the inner sect, he might have changed. Master Lin's words to him were the harshest of demands, but they were also the deepest of expectations. Jingjiu nodded to the crowd, turned around, and walked out of the Sword Peak. The disciples then realized that he was going to leave. The disciple, surnamed Zhu, said in shock, "Didn't you say you were going to get Master Mo's sword?" The other disciples were also stunned, thinking that this person was really as powerful as the rumors said. At this moment, a group of people walked out of the forest on the west side of the Sword Peak. The leader was a handsome young man in a plain sword robe. His eyebrows were like swords, and his expression was as cold as ice. He had an extraordinary aura. What was more shocking was that he didn't carry a sword on his back. Could it be that he had already reached the advanced level of the sword pill and entered the undefeated state at such a young age? The caretakers of Yunqing Peak went up to him and said a few words. Then the crowd realized that this person was Gu Han, one of the teachers of the sword-washing pavilion. Gu Han had another important identity. He was the 3rd brother of Liangwang Peak. It could be said that the most talented young disciples of Aoyama's sect were gathered on Liangwang Peak. Gu Han was ranked 3rd, which showed how powerful his sword cultivation was. Looking at Gu Han, the disciples showed admiration and awe on their faces. Jingjiu didn't look at Gu Han. He just looked at the person beside Gu Han in silence. There was a teenager standing beside Gu Han. It had been 3 years since they met at the entrance of the village, and he had become 13 years old. He was a teenager now, but his eyebrows were still straight, his eyes were still straight, and his face was still dark. After 1 year of cultivation in the Nine Peaks, Lu Shui had become more mature. He was calm, and his expression was calm. He looked at a place with a puzzled expression, which soon turned into surprise. Chapter 24. Because he ran so fast, Lu Shui's hands were dragged behind him, looking like a duckling, which was quite funny and cute. Jingjiu stood where he was, waiting for him, with a faint smile on the corners of his mouth. Lu Shui ran to the front of Jingjiu and stopped. Because he ran so fast and stopped so fast, his feet drew 2 shallow marks on the grass, and his body swayed back and forth. It took him a while to stop. The scene was so funny that some of the young disciples who were with Jingjiu couldn't help but laugh out loud. Soon, the laughter disappeared. They guessed that this young man was the one with natural Tao quality. Standing in front of Jingjiu, Lu Shui was quite excited. He reached out his hand to grab Jingjiu's hand, but he thought it was inappropriate, so he withdrew his hand and clenched it into a fist. The group of people walking out of the forest felt surprised when they saw the scene. It was well known that Lu Shui spent most of his time cultivating and practicing sword work, living a monotonous life. He was plain and low-key, so it was rare to see him so excited. "Who is this person?" Guhan asked. A disciple said, "Master Gu, this person should be Jingjiu, whom Shui often mentioned." Hearing this, the group of people realized why Lu Shui was so excited. Guhan looked at Jingjiu's face, raising his eyebrows slightly, showing his displeasure. It was unclear whether it was because the face was too beautiful or because the expression on the face was too calm, but it formed a sharp contrast with Lu Shui. As Jingjiu was about to speak, a cold voice rang out. "What are you doing?" Jingjiu looked in the direction of the voice and found it was the disciple of Liangwang Peak named Guhan. Lu Shui was a bit startled and explained hurriedly, "Master Gu, this is my—" Guhan didn't let him finish his words and said calmly, "I told you that nothing can distract you at such an important moment." The hidden meaning of this statement was clear. He didn't care who Jingjiu was. "Come here and receive your punishment," Guhan said. Jingjiu glanced at him. Lu Shui waved his hand and walked in front of Guhan. A fat man with a bun walked out from behind Guhan. He was holding something wrapped in cloth in his hands. He used his fat and nimble fingers to untie the string, revealing the stick inside. Seeing this, the crowd was in an uproar. The gazes on Lu Shui were more sympathetic, but more envious. Those disciples walking out of the forest also had the same emotion in their eyes. That stick was not the sword justice of the Green Mountain sect, but the rule of Liangwang Peak. Guhan used the rules of Liangwang Peak to punish Lu Shui, which was tantamount to disciplining him as a personal disciple of Liangwang Peak. Guhan punished Lu Shui with the rules of Liangwang Peak, which meant that he was disciplining Lu Shui as a personal disciple of Liangwang Peak. For those inner sect disciples who were looking forward to being selected by Liangwang Peak in the inherited sword competition, this kind of discipline was really enviable. Lu Shui couldn't use his Jinyuan to protect his body when he was being punished, so all he could do was endure it. When receiving the punishment, Lu Shui couldn't activate the protective armor of Jinyuan, so he had to stand still. Lu Shui was in great pain, his eyes full of tears, but he still had to stand still in the same spot. Suddenly, he felt something. He looked over and saw Guhan's indifferent eyes. Suddenly, he felt something. He looked over and saw Guhan's indifferent eyes. He looked at him in silence. Lu Shui noticed his eyes and kept shaking his head despite the pain, signaling him not to act recklessly. After a moment of silence, Jingjiu turned around and walked out of the peak. Among all the people present, only Guhan noticed that he also shook his head when he turned around. Enough. Guhan signaled the end of the punishment. Looking at the back of Jingjiu walking away, he frowned slightly. The fat man took back the stick and carefully wrapped it in a green cloth. Following his line of sight, he squinted his eyes and smiled, but a cold light flashed across his eyes. "What do you think? This disciple is very famous. Today, I can see that he deserves his reputation. He is really good-looking, which makes people jealous. As disciples of Liangwang Peak, they didn't care about such trivial things as beauty or ugliness. They were talking about Jingjiu's talent and potential in cultivation. Guhan said, his Tao quality is ordinary, and his talent is ordinary. If he really doesn't want to make progress as rumored, then he must have prepared a lot of elixirs to break through the state in 2 years. The fat man said, he may be a young master in Zhaoga dynasty, so it is normal that he has some precious elixirs. Besides, it is said that he is very smart. Do you want to talk to him? Guhan said, the sword of our Liangwang Peak is used to kill people. No matter how smart or intelligent he is, it is useless. If we can use elixirs to seek the Tao, why do we need to cultivate? They didn't hide their conversation from Lu Shui. Lu Shui was a bit anxious and wanted to defend Jingjiu. In his opinion, it would be best if his young master could also become a disciple of Liangwang Peak in advance. A disciple of Liangwang Peak can't be a servant. Remember this. Guhan looked at Lu Shui and said in an unquestionable tone, don't keep in touch with him. Lu Shui was stunned. Guhan didn't pay attention to him and walked toward the sword peak with a group of disciples. Lu Shui stood on the same spot, remaining silent for a long time, and finally followed them. Looking at the group of people walking toward the cliffs of the sword peak, a disciple who knew about the situation of Sword Washing Pavilion asked confusedly, isn't Master Gu the immortal master of Class A? Haven't they taken their swords yet? The caretaker of Yunxing Peak said, younger brother Lu took his sword half a year ago. The other disciples felt even more strange, wondering why they still came to the sword peak. The group of people led by Guhan had walked to the top of the sword peak and were getting farther and farther away. They were about to become a string of black spots on the cliffs. Without a master to guide them, these disciples didn't dare to follow them, so they could only watch from the foot of the peak. As time went by, more caretakers, teachers, and students of Yunxing Peak arrived. More than a dozen sword lights cut through the sky. People from all the peaks were here, including 2 second-generation senior masters. All these seemed to indicate that something big was going to happen later. The mountain was getting higher, and the air was getting thinner. The terrain became steeper, and every step was very difficult. The young disciples stopped and stayed where they were, feeling the sword wills around them to sharpen their willpower and improve their cultivation. Guhan, the fat man, and Lu Shui kept moving forward. After walking for a long time, the scenery around them became blurry and the fog became thicker. They must have come to the edge of the clouds. At this point, the sword wills coming out from the sword peak were even more dreadful. Lu Shui's face turned red, and he breathed rapidly. After all, he was still young and had only cultivated for a short time. However, he was much stronger than his peers who stayed at the foot of the peak since he was able to come this far. The fat man was also panting a bit. He held his waist and said, I wonder if Zhao Liu is here today. Guhan's expression was as usual. The sword wills on the sword peak and such a high level were nothing to him. Hearing the fat man's words, he looked at the peak in the deeper part of the clouds. After a moment of silence, he waved his hand, as if he wanted to dispel some unpleasant images from his mind. As he waved his hand, a gust of wind arose on the cliff, dispersing all the clouds and fog. The surrounding environment suddenly became clear. In front of them was a broken cliff, and they would fall if they took one step forward. The cliff walls were smooth and without grass, so there was no place for them to grab hold of. Lu Shui walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down. This place was more than 3,000 feet above the ground. Even though his eyesight was as good as that of a divine eagle after cultivation, he still could not see the ground clearly. All he could see were many black spots. Each black spot was a person. Thinking that so many people were looking at him, the young man became even more nervous, and his breathing became more rapid. He recited the book of swordplay in silence, trying to calm himself down. When his breathing became steady, he slowly raised his right hand. With a swoosh, A flying sword about 2 feet long with a body as smooth as a mirror flew out from his sleeve. The flying sword drew a few arcs in the air and then stopped in the air outside the cliff in silence, just in front of him, following his spiritual thoughts. He only needed to take 1 step forward and he would be able to stand on the flying sword. The problem was how many people in the world had the courage to take this step. 1 step forward and the world would be open. 1 step backward and he would be in the mortal world. One should not think about anything for too long. The longer one thought, the easier it would be for something to go wrong. Lu Shui stared at the clouds outside the mountain, his face slightly pale. He still could not take this step. Gu Han said expressionlessly behind him, "I will give you 10 breaths of time. If you cannot walk out by yourself, I will push you out." "No need." Lu Shui suddenly turned around and said to him, "Teacher Gu, I still want to meet Gongzi." After saying this, he walked forward. Gu Han was slightly angry, raised his eyebrows, and was about to do something when he saw this scene. Lu Shui walked to the sky outside the cliff. His right foot landed on the flying sword. The flying sword sank down and stopped after about half a foot. Then, his left foot also stepped on the sword. The cold wind howled, beating against the cliff of the sword peak and also blowing up his clothes. Lu Shui opened his arms, slightly bent his legs, and swayed left and right, looking for balance. No fear could be seen on his face, only concentration. Gu Han suddenly thought of the scene when Lu Shui rushed to the front of Jingjio and stopped abruptly. The wind rolled back from the cliff, and Lu Shui's body leaned forward. The fat man standing on the cliff trembled in fear. Lu Shui shouted something and flew up into the sky with the help of the wind. This was the first time he flew on a sword, so he couldn't form a sword light, so he could only form a residual shadow. The shadow of the sword traveled through the clouds and fog, stopping or turning from time to time. It looked very chaotic and dangerous. Screams and screams could be heard from the bottom of the cliff. The fat man, with a pale face, murmured to himself, "If Shui falls to his death, will the sect master expel us from Aoyama?" Gu Han didn't say anything, but stared at the shadow of the sword that was getting farther and farther away from the cliff. No matter how dangerous it was for Lu Shui to ride the sword, and he even fell down to the ground twice, Gu Han didn't show any concern, but narrowed his eyes more and more. Considering Lu Shui's cultivation state, age, and experience, it was very difficult for him to start learning how to ride the sword, which meant risks. As such, Gu Han didn't tell his colleagues on Liangwang Peak, nor did he report it to the masters. But he knew that the masters of the 9 peaks should have guessed the truth when he led Lu Shui to the Sword Peak, and there should be a few senior masters in the state of free travel watching them in the clouds, ready to rescue him at any time. After a long while, the shadow of the sword finally stabilized, and the figure of Lu Shui could be seen clearly. The flying sword flew faster and faster until it turned into a flowing light, heading toward the top of the sword peak, breaking through the clouds and going somewhere. Chapter 25. Gu Han knew where Lu Shui had flown to. Back then, after he had successfully ridden his sword for the first time on the sword peak, he had also gone above the clouds. Flying on a sword was a cultivator's most wonderful imagination. Once they succeeded, it would be the most wonderful experience. Who wouldn't want to see how high the sky was? Cheers could be heard from below. Gu Han looked at the peak and thought to himself, "You are not the only one with natural Tao quality in the Aoyama sect." Looking at his gaze, the fat man knew what he was thinking, so he persuaded, "My junior sister doesn't want to join the Liangwang Peak. She must have her own plan. Don't be angry, big brother." Gu Han didn't respond, but said, "Shui is at the critical stage of cultivation. Don't let him meet that useless guy, lest he be affected." Fatty was stunned for a moment before realizing that he was talking about Jingjio. Jingjio returned to his cave residence. It was different from the layout of the stone rooms in the front yard and back of the South Pine Pavilion. The Immortal's Cave was real. The abode was located on the cliffs on both sides of the sword washing stream. It was very quiet, undisturbed, and the scenery was very beautiful. Every morning, a plate of precious fruits and a pot of clear water would appear in front of the cave abode. This plate of precious fruits was, of course, much better than the ones in the outer sect. The one in charge of distribution was no longer the deacon, but the sword sheath. As the number one sword sect in the continent, the foundation and accumulation of Aoyama's sect was unimaginable. Jingjiao had seen this kind of behavior many times, so he didn't feel sentimental about it. He picked a good-looking fruit and ate it, and threw the rest of the fruit to the monkeys in the forest behind the cave, and then lay back on the bamboo chair. He took out the sword manual from his bosom and glanced at it, then stopped looking at it. It was similar to the situation at the South Pine Pavilion. His spiritual sea was too deep and vast. If he wanted to completely turn it into nutrients for the Tao seed until it formed the sword fruit, he needed time. Fortunately, the time needed this time was much shorter, and if he wanted to go to the mountain to get the sword, he didn't need to form a sword pellet. He picked up a grain of white sand and wanted to put on a porcelain plate, but he found that his heart was not calm today. This was very rare for him, so he put away the porcelain plate and the sand, closed his eyes, and began to meditate. After some time, he opened his eyes again. The sun had set and the stars were bright. Shui stood in front of the bamboo chair. It was as if he was still by the pond 3 years ago. "Young master." Lu Shui happily bowed to him. Thinking about what happened during the day, he explained, "Don't blame Senior Marshal Brother Gu. He's a good person, just a bit strict." When Jingjiao heard this, he noticed a problem. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Senior brother?" Lu Shui smiled a little embarrassedly and said, "I should call him Teacher Gu. He thinks I'm okay," and said that he would tease me in the inherited sword competition. He allowed me to call him senior brother in private. He didn't feel proud or complacent. He was just happy. Jingjiao smiled, but didn't say anything. Lu Shui thought he was laughing at him and couldn't help blushing. He didn't know what to do, so he stood up and went to make the bed for Jingjiao and tidied up the things on the couch. The natural Tao quality that Aoyama's sect valued the most, and the genius disciple that Liangwang Peak desperately wanted, made the bed for a disciple who had just entered the inner gate in such a natural manner. If someone saw this scene, they would definitely be shocked, speechless. What was more surprising was that Jingjiao didn't intend to stop him. After making the bed and sweeping the ground in front of the manor cave, he began to tell Jingjiao what he had done and who he had met in the past year. Jingjiao listened quietly, laughing once in a while and responding once in a while. He didn't get impatient, didn't close his eyes, and didn't sleep. He was different from when he was in the mountain village. Lu Shui was a little depressed because he was the one who talked. He actually wanted to know how Jingjiao spent the past year at the South Pine Pavilion. Why did he suddenly become so diligent? How did he reach the consummate state of spiritual stability and enter the inner gate? Jingjiao didn't seem to be interested in talking about these things. Was it because they hadn't seen each other for a year that he felt a little strange? Lu Shui thought of a possibility. He stood up excitedly and said to Jingjiao, "Young master, let me introduce you to Senior Brother Gu. With your talent of understanding, you will definitely win his appreciation. Even if he doesn't promise to invite you to join the peak in the inherited sword competition, he will definitely be willing to teach you sword art. By then, we can cultivate together." Jingjiao shook his head without hesitation and said, "No need." Lu Shui was stunned and said, "Young master, you may not know that Liangwang Peak is the most remarkable place in Aoyama. All the disciples on the peak are of the 3rd generation, and there are no peak heads or seniors. However, the masters of each peak will choose a day to give lessons on Liangwang Peak. That is to say, as long as you are a disciple of Liangwang Peak, you can learn all the sword arts of the 9 peaks." His voice became lighter and lighter until it disappeared, because Jingjiao still showed no interest. Lu Shui was a little disappointed. Seeing the expression on his small face, Jingjiao explained, "I'm indeed not interested because I don't like Liangwang Peak." And that Senior Brother Gu of yours." Lu Shui was shocked. He had never thought that someone would dislike Liangwang Peak. Liangwang Peak is the sword of Aoyama. The disciples on the peak are responsible for patrolling and preventing Bulo Lin and the devil men of the underworld from sneaking in. They also have to represent Aoyama to participate in the plum meeting held once every 10 years. It can be said that cultivation is a constant battle. Many people bleed and die every year, but none of the disciples have ever retreated. How could the disciples of Aoyama not like this place? He looked at Jingjio and said earnestly, "And Senior Brother Gu, he is really a good person. How can I not like it?" This statement is wrong. Jingjio said, "For example, I don't care if your Senior Brother Gu is a good person or not. Even if he is a saint, I can still dislike him." Lu Shui was taken aback. He thought what Jingjio said was unreasonable, but he couldn't find any fault with it. "I can't outtalk you." Lu Shui felt wronged because he couldn't understand why Jingjio didn't like such a good person as Senior Brother Gu. Was it because Senior Brother Gu punished him with the peak rules during the day? What about Liangwang Peak? The more Lu Shui thought about it, the more he felt that there was only one possibility, so he remained silent. After leaving the manor cave by the cliff and walking along the mountain path for half a mile, Lu Shui stood on his sword and flew up. He didn't want Jingjio to see this scene, because he was worried that it would irritate him. The flying sword flew up along the cliff wall, and soon broke through a few scattered clouds, arriving at a high altitude in the night sky. The cold wind blew in his face. Without using the sword source to protect his body, Lu Shui didn't feel cold. Instead, he felt hot. Riding the sword to fly was undoubtedly the most exciting thing for him at the moment. Looking at the clouds under the starry sky, the sword-washing stream below, and the peaks not far away, he couldn't help but shout. Then he came to his senses, covered his mouth, and looked around. Jingjio raised his head to look at the night sky. The shout came from a high altitude in the night sky, so none of the disciples of the inner core by the stream should have heard it. But for him, whose hearing was far better than his peers, it was as clear as if it was right beside his ears. He recognized it was Shui's voice, and he could even hear the excitement in it. He wasn't surprised that Lu Shui could improve his state so fast that he could ride the sword to fly in only 1 year. The advantage of natural Dao quality would be put into full play after entering the inner core. Liangwang Peak had planned ahead of time to get Lu Shui in the inherited sword competition. Those guys had good foresight, but he really didn't like the taste of Liangwang Peak now. Touching the bracelet on his left wrist, he thought, well, I never liked Liangwang Peak from the beginning, and this is the proof. Senior brother? Nice guy. What? Chapter 26. The next night, Lu Shui came to Jingjio's manor cave again, but he didn't stay long. He left after saying a few words to Jingjio. As a person with natural Dao quality whom the whole Aoyama sect had high hopes for, Lu Shui was under great pressure. There were many other talented disciples in the inner sect who practiced harder than him, even if they weren't as good as him. Not to mention that he was learning sword work from Guhan, and he often met those freaks on Liangwang Peak, so he couldn't relax. On the third night, Lu Shui came. He made the bed, folded the quilt, and served Jingjio tea. Jingjio noticed that his left leg couldn't walk properly, and then he found a wound on the back of his neck. "You were beaten again?" Lu Shui explained hurriedly. "It has nothing to do with Big Brother Gu. I got hurt in a sword fight." Jingjio didn't say anything. Perhaps it was because he lied, or because he defended Guhan in front of Jingjio. Lu Shui felt the atmosphere became a bit awkward. "Then, young master, I'm leaving." Jingjio didn't respond to him. Outside the cave, the wind rose, and the sword light illuminated a corner of the night sky, disappearing in an instant. Jingjio raised his head and looked in that direction, remaining silent. He knew the style of Liangwang Peak. Any disciple chosen by them would be strictly controlled, so Lu Shui must be under great pressure. On the fourth night, the small courtyard was pushed open again, but it wasn't Lu Shui who came, but the fat man he met on Sword Peak the other day. "My name is Mahua. It's an inconspicuous name, ranked 37th on Liangwang Peak, but of course I'm much more important than you," although you are more famous than me. You should know why I'm here tonight. Yes, I'm here to deliver a message on behalf of Third Brother Gu, asking you not to see Sure Sui anymore. You don't have to rush to say anything. I know you despise this kind of means, and as long as you don't join Liang Wang Peak, we have no reason to care about you. But don't forget that Sure Sui is learning sword with us. Ma Hua looked at Jing Jiao and said with a smile, Sure Sui is punished by the peak rules every day. The injuries are not serious, but they are always painful. Why do you think it is necessary? Jing Jiao glanced at him. Ma Hua continued, at the South Pine Pavilion, Sure Sui can choose to follow you even if he doesn't cultivate, but you know that he can't make such a choice right now. Jing Jiao knew what he said was true. As someone with natural Dao quality, coming to the Nine Peaks, and coming into contact with the sword techniques of the great Dao that everyone yearned for, who could give up? Of course, we will not force him to make a choice. Ma Hua smiled and said, in fact, if he can't come to see you, you can go and see him. The hidden meaning in these words was profound, but for Jing Jiao, it was as clear as a stone in a shallow stream. Jing Jiao was a bit surprised. You want me to enter Liang Wang Peak? Ma Hua looked at him and said with a smile, my idea is different from Gu San's. I don't care whether you took the magic pill or how you entered the inner gate. All I know is that you're a real genius, and our Liang Wang Peak likes geniuses the most. The problem was that Jing Jiao didn't like Liang Wang Peak. He pointed to the outside of the cave, signaling for the guests to leave. Ma Hua's smile didn't fade, but became even brighter, saying, interesting, interesting. On the fifth night, Lu Shui came. Jing Jiao didn't see any wounds on his body, but he saw tiredness on his face and hesitation in his eyes. It was quiet in the manor cave. Shui finished cleaning up and stood in front of Jing Jiao, saying with his head lowered, it's too hard to practice sword work, and I have too much homework. I can't do it every day. Jing Jiao raised his hand. Shui understood what he meant and stopped talking. Cultivation has always been about concentration. Lu Shui raised his head and looked at Jing Jiao's profile. Jing Jiao was reading the Book of Sword, and it seemed that he was very focused. Lu Shui knew that Jing Jiao just didn't want to look at him. His young master was very lazy and never read. On the sixth night, Lu Shui didn't come. On the seventh night, he came. On the eighth night, he didn't come. On the ninth night, Jing Jiao raised his head and looked out of the window, making sure that it was late and he wouldn't come. After that, he didn't look out of the window again. The following days were still monotonous and indescribable. The disciples of the sword-washing pavilion practiced diligently, and the dozen disciples who entered the inner gate with Jing Jiao kept climbing the sword peak every day. It was said that some of them saw the hope of success. Only Jing Jiao stayed the same as he did at the South Pine Pavilion, basking in the sun every day and putting gravel into the plate, waiting for time to turn the vast spiritual ocean into nutrients for the sword fruit. Thus, he once again became an alien. But different from the South Pine Pavilion, the immortal master Lin Wuji from Tianguang Peak was only responsible for answering the disciples' questions and didn't care that Jing Jiao never went to class. The other disciples were curious at first, but after a period of observation, they found that Jing Jiao was just as the rumors said, so they no longer paid attention to him and didn't even talk about him. After all, the sword work was difficult and required diligence, so they didn't have time to care about others. After a few days, the North Crane Pavilion and other places sent a new batch of disciples who passed the assessment. Several disciples also came to the South Pine Pavilion, including Shui Yongyi, junior sister Yushan, and the youth surnamed Yuan from Lelong County. It seemed that Master Lu's departure didn't affect them much. In the sword-washing pavilion, Shui Yong publicized Jing Jiao's laziness and bad habits, but he didn't get much response. Junior sister Yushan and a youth from Lelong County defended Jing Jiao and specially visited Jing Jiao again. Jing Jiao still didn't understand, but he behaved much more friendly than when he was at the South Pine Pavilion. He remembered junior sister Yushan's name and invited her and the youth from Lelong County to eat 2 mountain fruits. That night, 2 monkeys climbed over the mountain and found that there were no fruits to eat, so they couldn't help but feel a little sad. Time passed slowly and peacefully like this. Lu Shui secretly came twice to make the bed, fold the quilt, sweep the courtyard, and say a few words for him. Maybe it was because he was under too much pressure or because cultivation was too hard, but he talked less and less. After a few days, Jingjiu learned from junior sister Yushan that the date of the inherited sword competition had been set. It would be held in early spring next year. After careful calculation, there was only half a year before the inherited sword competition. In this year's inherited sword competition, Zhao Liu was, of course, the most anticipated person, and she was the center of attention. It was said that even the other sects were discussing which peak had chosen her as the inheritor of the sword, and which peak she would eventually choose to inherit her sword. Besides Zhao Liu, Lu Shui received the most attention. Everyone was curious about the cultivation speed of this person with natural Taoist quality. Now Lu Shui's sword pill had been formed. If he could complete the perfect preservation state, he would be qualified to participate in the inherited sword competition and become the focus of all the peaks. In that case, he would be the second youngest sword inheritor in history. The next morning, Jingjiu left the cave residence. Chapter 27. Lu Shui had been learning swordsmanship from Guhan, but he was not qualified to enter Liangwang Peak, so he still practiced by the stream of sword washing. Jingjiu knew that place, but he had never left his cave residence, so he had never been there. Going upstream along the stream of sword washing, the water gradually widened. At the end, there was a smooth stone wall about hundreds of feet high. Clear water flowed down from the stone wall, creating ripples as it passed through the densely packed sword holes, looking very beautiful. A row of round stones emerged from the water every few feet, smooth and wet, making it difficult to stand steadily. More than 10 disciples were standing on the stones, practicing swordsmanship. The sword was awe-inspiring. Occasionally, there was the sound of wind breaking, white light flashed, and swords flew out from time to time. Some flying swords penetrated deep into the stone wall and then flew back. The disciples looked calm and confident. Some flying swords fell into the water when they were still a few feet away from the stone wall. The disciples jumped into the water to retrieve them, looking embarrassed and ashamed. Some disciples stood on the shore a little further away, watching this scene with envy. They had not yet been able to retrieve swords from the sword peak, but these disciples could already break the wall with flying sword from more than 10 feet away, entering the state of perfect preservation. Jingjiu saw Lu Shui also standing on the stone in the stream and walked over. Seeing his figure, the disciples were very surprised and began to discuss. Just like when he first walked out of the small courtyard at the South Pine Pavilion. Lu Shui took back his flying sword and looked at the clear sword hole in the stone wall, satisfied with his progress. Then he saw Jingjiu. He was very surprised, but then he showed a strong uneasiness. Because it was not convenient for him to speak, he shook his head at Jingjiu, signaling him to go back first, and he would find him later. It was too late. Guhan had already noticed the movement behind him. He turned to look at Jingjiu and asked coldly, "What's the matter?" Dozens of eyes fell on Jingjiu. Jingjiu glanced at him, but did not speak. Though not everybody could see the expression in Jingjiu's eyes, they could clearly sense his intention. If there is nothing, why am I here? Since that's the case, your question is naturally nonsense. The atmosphere by the stream immediately became somewhat uneasy. Unexpectedly, Guhan didn't get angry. Instead, he asked, "What is it?" Jingjiu said, "It's none of your business." The riverside was in an uproar. Regardless of whether it was the disciples or the teachers, they were all extremely shocked. An ordinary disciple dared to speak to senior brother Guhan of Liangwang Peak with such an attitude. Jingjiu didn't mean to humiliate Guhan on purpose. He didn't even understand why everyone was so shocked. He was only answering Guhan's question. What he wanted to do had nothing to do with Guhan, but he didn't realize what his answer meant to the crowd. Lu Shui was extremely nervous and quickly ran back from the stream. He wanted to explain for Jingjiu, but was stopped by Guhan. It's already been half a year, but you still haven't made any progress. You can't even see the shadow of the sword fruit. Guhan looked at Jingjio expressionlessly and said, I heard that you want to use Senior Uncle Mo's sword. Do you think you're qualified? Jingjio said, yes. It was quiet by the riverside. Someone couldn't help but laugh out loud. People had thought about how Jingjio would respond to Guhan's rebuke, but they didn't expect him to end the conversation with a single word. He didn't even think about it when he said the word yes. Guhan's face turned gloomy, and he said in a cold voice, You can never step onto the path to heaven by relying on the magic pills. You should give up on this idea. This time, it wasn't Jingjio who gave the answer, but a gentle and majestic voice. The path to heaven. Who can judge which method is correct? The crowd dispersed, and Guhan also bowed slightly. The speaker was Senior Master Mei Li of Qingrong Peak. Her face was like the winter plum blossom in the snow, beautiful but not overbearing, exuding a sense of coldness. She looked at Guhan and said, No matter who leads you in, the cultivation is up to you. How Jingjio cultivates has nothing to do with you, so you shouldn't care about him. Guhan said expressionlessly, I don't care about his life or death. I only want to control his mouth. The crowd dispersed again, and young Sister Yushan and a youth Yuan from Lelong County hurried over with Lin Wuji. Lin Wuji looked at Guhan and said with a smile, Young brother Gu, Jingjio is a student in my class. Even if you want to control him, it's not your turn. Guhan took a deep breath and stared at Jingjio for a while, then turned around and walked toward the outside. You decide how to go from now on. He didn't say this to Jingjio, but to Lu Shui, and the meaning was clear. If Lu Shui didn't follow him and stayed with Jingjio, then he wouldn't have to try to climb Liangwang Peak anymore. Lu Shui glanced at Jingjio, then turned to look at Guhan in the distance, his face full of hesitation and struggle. Jingjio turned around and walked in the other direction. Looking at his back, Senior Master Mei Li of Qingrong Peak showed an appreciative expression. Jingjio, you have to work harder and get the sword as soon as possible, she said to Jingjio, who was walking away. Jingjio didn't turn around, nor did he stop walking. Oh, okay. Looking at Jingjio disappearing at the bend of the stream, Senior Master Mei Li narrowed her eyes slightly, thinking about something. Lin Wuji walked to her side and said with a smile, Senior Master, is Qingrong Peak also interested in Jingjio? Senior Master Mei Li glanced at him and said, If this is the sect master's idea, then we won't compete. Lin Wuji said, It's Senior Master Mo's idea. He wants to see if Jingjio has a chance. Senior Master Mei Li sneered and said, Then you don't have to think about it. As long as Jingjio can inherit the sword, he will definitely join our Qingrong Peak. Look at his birth. Where else can he go if not to our peak? The two of them exchanged a glance and then separated. For the Aoyama sect, the inherited sword competition had a great influence on the inheritance and resources of the peaks. If they could get a truly outstanding disciple, there would be one more swordsman in the state of Broken Sea in a few decades or even hundreds of years. If they missed out on that outstanding disciple, it was tantamount to giving this swordsman to another sword peak. Jingjio was obviously an extraordinary disciple, so who wouldn't pay attention to him? If he was proved to be useless in the end, then it would be fine. But there was still half a year before the inherited sword competition, and there would be another inherited sword competition. Who would give up all hope in advance? Only Liangwang Peak, which didn't need the inheritance and didn't lack geniuses, could have someone like him. Jingjio knew clearly why Mei Li and Lin Wuji of Qingrong Peak came out to help him, but he didn't care. He wasn't sure which peak he wanted to go to until now. Back in a manor cave, he opened his palm and looked at the light blue magic pill in his palm, remaining silent for a while. This magic pill was called the Xuanji pill, which could help stabilize the sword pill of the disciples in the state of perfect preservation, so it was very rare. Yesterday, young Sister Yushan told him about the inherited sword competition, and he thought Shui might need it. So he came here today, and then he encountered what happened today. Thinking of the glance Guhan gave him before he left, Jingjiu raised his eyebrows slightly, revealing a faint smile on his beautiful face, and murmured, "Interesting." For Jingjiu, boredom was a rare emotion, and so was interesting. Before Guhan left, he looked at Jingjiu deeply, using the piercing discernment to check both inside and outside of his body. It was overbearing and fierce, unreasonable and condescending. Jingjiu hadn't encountered such a thing for many years. He wasn't used to it, and he didn't like it. If he had encountered such a thing years ago and felt unhappy, what would he have done? Jingjiu recalled in silence. If he didn't like it, he would kill him with a sword. Of course, he couldn't do it now. Guhan didn't deserve to die. He wasn't a person who liked to kill. More importantly, he had to kill him with a sword. First of all, he had to have a sword. He didn't have a sword now. And without a sword, he couldn't participate in the inherited sword competition. It seemed that he really needed a sword. The bracelet on his wrist vibrated slightly. "I can't use you," Jingjiu said, and I promised little Mo he had to have a sword. The sword was on the sword peak. Chapter 28. It was late at night, and no one was at the bottom of the peak. The deacons of Yunqing Peak did not notice Jingjiu's arrival. On the formation map in the small building that showed the location of the sword plate, only Zhao Liu's sword plate could be seen in the distant depths of the clouds. The sword plate belonging to Jingjiu was lying quietly in the corner of the cave residence. Outside the cave, a few apes were leaping here and there among the cliffs. Jingjiu walked up the sword peak. There were no trees in the sword peak, and the rocks between the cliffs were full of sword wills. Except for weeds, it was difficult for other plants to survive here. As for wild beasts, there was not a single one. As far as the eye could see, it was desolate and lifeless. For ordinary inner disciples, it was very difficult to walk in the sword peak. Even those who had successfully obtained a sword would still feel a lingering fear whenever they thought of the feeling on the sword peak. But for Jingjiu, the sword peak was the same as anywhere else, with nothing special. He walked among the peaks as if he were walking on the flat ground. Although he could not walk as fast as flying, his speed was extremely fast. No matter how steep the cliffs were, he would not climb with his hands, nor did he feel that he exerted much strength. In short, he walked up easily. Soon, he came to the middle of the sword peak and the edge of the clouds. If someone looked up from the bottom of the peak, he would only see a black spot among the rocks. Those who could climb the sword peak for the first time and reach the edge of the clouds were all outstanding inner disciples. Those who could walk directly into the clouds were even rarer. Jingjiu walked in. On Yunqing Peak, the clouds were always moving. Thick and humid clouds rolled in and out of the sky, blocking out all the light. It was pitch black. The sword wills here were more numerous and more sword wills. An ordinary disciple would not be able to withstand the sword wills in a few breaths. These sword wills and darkness had no effect on Jingjiu. On the contrary, after he came to the clouds, he did not need to hide his figure, so he walked up faster until he turned into a wisp of smoke. Every step he took covered dozens of feet. His ears moved with the wind, listening to the sounds between heaven and earth to ensure that he would not encounter any obstacles. After an unknown period of time, Jingjiu stopped. This place shouldn't be far from the top of the peak. Lin Wuji's judgment was correct. Before Senior Master Mo of Shuriwei Peak passed away, his pride was indeed stimulated by Jingjiu's words, and he broke through his limit, returning his sword to such a high peak. In silence, Jingjiu sensed the hundreds of sword wills around him, which had become fewer but had become more somber. He judged that they should still be higher up, so he leaped up. Without a sound, his feet landed on the ground. The thick clouds gradually dispersed. Jingjiu saw a pair of eyes. That pair of eyes was very beautiful. The white pupils were like mercury, and the black pupils were like dots of paint. If an ordinary person were to suddenly see such a pair of eyes in the clouds at the top of the sword peak, they would definitely be shocked. Correspondingly, the owner of the pair of eyes would also be shocked. But neither Jingjiu nor the owner of those eyes were ordinary people. That was why there were no screams, only silence. They could only see each other's eyes, which meant that their faces were very close. "Sorry, I didn't know someone was here," Jingjio said. His breath stirred up a breeze, stirring up a lock of black hair, which drifted past his eyes like a willow branch skimming over the surface of the water. Jingjio took a step back and saw the other person's face. That face was also very good-looking, though not as good-looking as Jingjio's, but it was still picturesque. But the girl's eyebrows were a bit short, very dark, and her hair was very, very short. The girl's hair and face were dusty, looking very dirty, as if she hadn't washed them for a long time. This was a cliff wall, and there was a hole in the wall that was half the height of a person. The girl sat cross-legged in the hole, looking like a stone statue. Jingjio remembered who she was. There was only one person in the entire Aoyama sect who stayed on the Sword Peak all year long, practicing the tempered will of the sword. Zhao Leu. "Who are you?" Zhao Leu asked. Her voice was very pleasant, as clear as the sound of a sword. The last sound rose slightly, as if a sword bent by the autumn water was bounced back. "Jingjio." After some thought, Zhao Leu said, "I seem to have heard of you." Jingjio said, "I have also heard of you." Zhao Leu tilted her head and looked at his face, suddenly saying, "You are not as good-looking as the rumors say." "Perhaps the rumors are too exaggerated." Jingjio nodded to her, left the cliff wall, and went to a higher place. Zhao Leu didn't pay any attention to him. Without thinking too much, she closed her eyes and continued to feel the sword wills around her. The other meaning is natural, so when used, all things in the world will have their own nature. Her breathing rose and fell with the sword wills, gradually becoming tranquil and extremely slow, until there seemed to be no interval between them. Her heartbeat also slowed down, which was hard to hear amidst the whistling wind and the chaotic sword wills on the cliff. Jingjio went around to a cliff wall on the west side of the Sword Peak. He was still thinking about Zhao Leu. He didn't know if it was because he had heard this name too many times, but he felt it was familiar, as if he had heard it before. And those clear black and white eyes, he felt he had seen them somewhere before. In everyone's eyes, Zhao Leu, who was valued by the school, loved by the teachers, and would shine after the inherited sword competition, had sharp and high-spirited eyes. But in Jingjio's eyes, her eyes were not so simple. They seemed to be hiding something, and there was a touch of melancholy. But that had nothing to do with him. He looked around, making sure that the sword he was looking for was here. Then he released his sword discernment with a thought. Within the range of his sword discernment of hundreds of feet, and even some places further away, those swords hidden in the cliffs all sensed it. The cliffs shook slightly, as if they were blown by the wind, and the gravel fell down. Countless sword wills rushed up, but as soon as they came in contact with his sword discernment, they immediately returned to the cliffs and refused to come out again. They were like rabbits that had sensed the danger. If someone could see this scene, he would find it very interesting. But no one could clearly see the scene in the clouds of the Sword Peak, unless they were in it. Between the cliffs on the east side of the Sword Peak, Zhao Leu opened her eyes, feeling the slight changes of the sword wills between heaven and earth, wondering what had happened. On the other side, far away, feeling the retreat and quietness of those sword wills, Jingjio said, "Don't think that you don't deserve me." After a pause, he added, "Of course, you really don't deserve me." Finally, he said, "But I don't care." The swords in the Sword Peak were still silent. "I won't stay in the mountains like I used to," Yi Futian said. Jingjio understood what they meant. He thought for a while and said, "This time I'm going to go out and have a look." The sword wills suddenly rose, scrambling to be the first. Chapter 29. In the distance, Zhao Leu sensed the change of the sword wills again. She squinted her eyes and wondered if it had something to do with the young disciple. After a while, she shook her head. She had been with these sword wills for a long time and knew that they had no consciousness but only meaning. If the meaning of these sword wills was love and care for her, then these sword wills were submission. The sword wills would only submit to the sword, not to the person. Was there going to be a new famous sword in the peak? In the mountain full of sword wills, Jingjio finally found the one he wanted. Hundreds of sword wills sensed his will and gradually calmed down, returning to the peak. Jingjiu walked to the cliff. A sword slowly emerged from the cliff. The scene looked a little weird. The sword was black and had a dim luster. It looked a little ordinary. In terms of the purity of the sword wills, it was not outstanding compared to other swords. This was the sword of Master Mo, who had passed away half a year ago. It was also the sword that Jingjiu needed. Jingjiu touched the body of the sword and found it was really wide. He nodded with satisfaction. When he was about to take the sword, he suddenly found something and looked up to the east. The sword wills were so strong on the peak, and the clouds were so thick that no starlight could fall. It was hard to see anything with the awareness of sword. The environment here could be said to be really dark. To see the scenery more than 300 meters away, one had to reach at least the state of the undefeated. If one wanted to see further, one had to reach a higher state. For Jingjiu, this was not a problem. His state was still low, but the sword wills could not affect him. Instead, they could help him see clearly. He saw the iron eagle land in front of the cliff. The iron eagle was the only living creature that could survive in the sword peak. The iron eagle's feathers were harder than steel, and its bones were like spiritual stones. Its whole body was the most precious material for arrows. If it were not for the fact that it could not be used in the military formation and that it was taken as the mountain protection bird of the Aoyama sect, this kind of rare bird would have been hunted to extinction by the imperial court. It was a young eagle that had suffered serious injuries. It was struggling on the cliff, but it was unable to stand up. Its abdomen was bleeding nonstop. It was unknown if this young eagle was injured by the enemy's flying sword in the outside world, or if it was unlucky enough to be injured by the birth of the sword embryo in the peak. Jingjiu thought. Everything in the world had its own path of life and death. He did not intend to interfere in this matter. He just wanted to see what would happen next. Zhao Liu was sitting on the cliff. Her cultivation of the tempered body of sword will had reached the most critical moment, and she was unable to get up at will. She looked at the struggling iron eagle in silence. There was no pity in her eyes, nor any other emotions. Jingjiu looked at her in silence. Zhao Liu moved. She raised her hand, and a green sword light shot out from her sleeves, arriving in front of the young eagle. Jingjiu raised his eyebrows slightly. Judging from the way she rode the sword, she had actually entered the state of inherited will. No wonder she was born with Tao quality. But he did not know why she concealed this fact. Until now, no one in the Aoyama sect knew about it. Zhao Liu did not kill the young eagle to give it a quick death. The green sword light broke through the air and returned, bringing back the young eagle. She tore off a piece of her clothes and carefully bandaged the eagle. Seeing this, Jingjiu shook his head and lifted his head to look at a spot in the distance. A middle-aged man in gray appeared on the cliff 1,000 feet away. In the peak full of sword wills and true darkness, Zhao Liu should not have been able to see him due to her state. She lowered her head and continued to bandage the young eagle. She didn't raise her head until she finished looking over there. It turned out that she had already discovered him. You are indeed born with Tao quality and a rare talent in swordsmanship. You can actually find me from such a distance. The middle-aged man in gray looked at Zhao Liu and said emotionlessly, "No wonder those guys on Lianwang Peak are crazy about you." "Who are you?" Zhao Liu asked while looking at the spot where the other person was in the darkness of the night. The middle-aged man in gray said, "My family name is Zhua." After a moment of silence, Zhao Liu said, "You are Master Zhua of Bihu Peak." This master didn't carry a sword on his back, so he should be a swordsman in the state of undefeated. Looking at the young eagle in Zhao Liu's hand, Master Zhua said, "This little guy didn't interrupt your cultivation, but he found out your level. I didn't expect you to hide your real state and enter the state of inherited will at such a young age. This is really amazing." Zhao Liu put the injured young eagle behind her and didn't answer. Master Zhua continued, "Now I want to know two things. First, which peak chose you as the inherited sword disciple? Is it the sect master again? Second, if you don't die quietly tonight, I don't know what kind of chapter you will write in the history of cultivation." Thinking of this, I can't bear to see you die. He came to kill Zhao Liu. The Aoyama sect regarded Zhao Liu as a treasure, but someone actually wanted to kill her? Standing in the darkness, Jingjiu looked at the man in the distance and listened to the conversation, feeling puzzled. Was this man a spy from another sect? Or was he a killer from Zhaoga City hiding in Aoyama? How could there be a spy in the place Yuan Qijing was staring at? This was really unimaginable. Master Zhuo of Bihu Peak was just expressing his feelings, not expecting Zhao Liu's reply. Along with his voice, a faint but cold, killing intent fell on Zhao Liu from a distance of more than 300 feet. He was a swordsman in the state of undefeated, but he still behaved cautiously in front of a younger disciple who was far weaker than him, because the person he wanted to kill was Zhao Liu. He had already found out that Zhao Liu's true state was the state of inherited will, so he wouldn't come within 300 feet of Zhao Liu. Even if he had reached the state of inherited will, the killing range of his flying sword was no more than 300 feet. No matter how talented Zhao Liu was, she couldn't launch an attack from such a long distance. At such a distance, Zhui Sidian, who was in the state of undefeated, only needed to wave his hand to kill his opponent. This would be a battle without any suspense. Jing Jiu glanced at the night sky, confirming that the flying sword wouldn't be able to send the message in time. I don't understand what you mean, Master. Zhao Liu was still sitting in the cliff cave. It was unclear if she couldn't leave because the tempered will of sword was at a critical moment, or because she had already given up. Everything is chaotic when you come, but you have to know the reason when you leave. Masters was said, the reason I want to kill you is because you are investigating those things. Zhao Liu said, I don't know what you were talking about. Masters was said, you shouldn't be investigating those things. You're not qualified to investigate those things. Silence. Zhao Liu looked at him and said, so, there really is something. Of course there is. Otherwise, why would the Peak Master go crazy? Why would I take the risk to kill you? Masters looked at her and said emotionally, in fact, I don't understand. You have a bright future ahead of you. Why have you been investigating this matter for the past 3 years? How did you know? Why do you want to investigate? And what do you want to find out? If I didn't have an old friend in the curtain rollers, I wouldn't know it was you who was investigating. His tone was full of regret and pity. It seemed that he really didn't want to kill Zhao Liu. Silence. Jingjiu listened to him without saying anything. He didn't even show himself. Have you ever thought about the consequences of killing me? Zhao Liu said, while looking at the night sky. She was the cherished future of the Aoyama sect and had a deep relationship with a certain peak. Even though the man in gray was her master, he would have a miserable end if he dared to attack her. Chapter 30. In addition, I have to thank you for your hard cultivation. I believe that no one will know that I killed you tomorrow. Masters was said with a smile. This is the top of the Sword Peak. Even a warrior in the Broken Sea state will not know what is going on here without using his discernment sword. If you don't want anyone to know what happened tonight, you have to make sure that you can kill me first. After saying that, Zhao Liu waved her hand, and a cyan sword light flew out of her sleeve, flying in front of the cliff wall at a high speed. Qing Jian was very agile and fast, forming a light cyan light screen, which seemed to be airtight. Seeing this, Masters was said with admiration, you have almost reached the consummation of the inherited will. That's amazing. In the darkness of the night, Jing Jiu also nodded. He appreciated Zhao Liu's technique more than her cultivation state. Since there was no chance for a sneak attack, it was better to call out the sword in advance to defend. Unfortunately, Zhao Liu's cultivation state was too low, so she couldn't defend herself even if she wanted to. Jing Jiu soon came to the conclusion that Zhao Liu would die tonight, unless something unexpected happened. The sword wills were chaotic on the top of Yunxing Peak. It was dark, and the atmosphere was changing, but the only variable was himself. I can't beat him, Jing Jiu sighed inwardly. His cultivation state was even lower, so he couldn't help her unless the man in gray didn't move. However, who would stand still and wait for you to reach out your hand? Jing Jiu looked at his bracelet, wondering what else he could do. At this moment, the battle began. There was no suspense about the outcome of this battle. It could even be said that it was a one-sided battle. The night wind suddenly broke, and the clouds were slightly disturbed. A plain gray flying sword flew over a distance of more than 300 feet in an instant and arrived in front of the cliff wall. A series of dense and light sounds of flying swords colliding rang out. Dozens of sparks appeared on the light screen, weaved by the small cyan sword almost at the same time. Jingjiu saw clearly that those seemingly small sparks actually contained the power of thunder and lightning, which had a terrible impact. The sword style of 8 Directions of Bihu Peak was still as powerful as ever. A moment later, the light curtain weaved by the small green sword was easily torn apart by the hidden lightning sword. The small green sword fell to the ground like a piece of scrap metal. Zhao Liu was sitting cross-legged in the hole in the wall, unable to dodge at all. With several muffled sounds, the simple gray flying sword continuously pierced her body and flew back, leaving behind 7 bloody holes. The 7 bloody holes pierced through her body and blood flowed out continuously. The scene looked very cruel. Zhao Liu's face was pale as she leaned against the cliff wall. Blood was flowing from the corner of her mouth, and her eyes were pale. A battle in the Sword Dao had always been decisive and simple. It only required an instant to determine the victor and the loser, down to life and death. The principle of the strong staying strong was very obvious and even cruel in the battle between flying swords. The one with a lower cultivation base would never be able to touch his opponent. So how could he defeat his opponent? Is there anything else you want to say? Martial Uncle Zhua walked slowly to the cliff and looked at Zhao Liu expressionlessly. This was not the way the victor toyed with and humiliated the weak before they died. If he wanted to, Zhao Liu would have been dead by now. However, the force behind him wanted to know what Zhao Liu wanted to find out and how much she had found out. Most importantly, who ordered her to investigate this matter? Qingrong Peak or Tianguang Peak? When a person was about to die, he would believe what he said. He hoped to obtain some valuable information. Zhao Liu lifted her head and looked at him, saying, "What I want to say is that you shouldn't have been so close to me." As she started to speak, something unexpected happened. The bracelet on her wrist suddenly turned into a silver light, shooting up like a snake. It lengthened instantly and turned into a sword rope, binding Martial Uncle Zhua's body. Along with the cracking sounds, Martial Uncle Zhua's gray sword robe had a few cracks. "You want to live with this thing?" Martial Uncle Zhua said coldly while looking at her. The simple gray flying sword appeared again and slashed at the sword rope. "Ha!" A fist-sized thunder fire appeared where the gray flying sword and the sword rope collided. However, the sword rope didn't break as he had expected. The expression on Martial Uncle Zhua's face changed slightly, wondering what was going on. The sword rope tightened and sank into his body. In an instant, blood oozed out. Martial Uncle Zhua grunted in pain, feeling extremely shocked and angry. The external disciples of the Aoyama sect usually carried sword ropes with them when they were patrolling in the wilderness to help them kill the demons and subdue their opponents. Those sword ropes were the most common magic treasures, not even as powerful as the flying swords of the low estate. Why couldn't his fairy sword cut this sword rope? What the hell was this thing? What material was it made of? In a short time, Martial Uncle Zhua had thought of many things and guessed that there was something wrong with this sword rope. It was not as common as it looked. It might be an important figure in the 9 Peaks, or it might even be a magic treasure given to Zhao Liu by the sect master. Thinking of this, Martial Uncle Zhua regretted not being careful enough. However, he wasn't afraid, nor was he worried. Even if the sword rope was a treasure, Zhao Liu's state was too low, and she was seriously injured. How could she change the final outcome? "Do you think you can kill me like this?" He stared into Zhao Liu's eyes, not concealing his anger and killing intent. The gray flying sword flew back to him and was swallowed by him. His sword pellet trembled, and countless sword wills shot out from his body. They were like real small swords that blocked the sword chains that were shrinking. The clouds parted to form a small line, and the starlight shone on Zhao Liu. Her messy short hair and face were covered in blood, but she didn't look ferocious because her eyes were still calm, like a cub ready to fight for the last time. The flying sword was destroyed, and the sword rope was blocked. What should she do next? Zhao Liu punched. She used the entry-level fist technique. It was the fist technique that the external disciples of the South Pine Pavilion practiced in the pine trees every day. This fist technique was very common, and it was used to help the external disciples train in the presentable realm. No one thought that this fist technique would appear in a fight between two swordsmen. There was nothing special about her fist technique, but it was very standard, exactly the same as the small figures on the pages. It was accurate because it was standard. Dozens of fists fell on martial Uncle Zhua like a storm. Zhao Liu's fists were small, but very hard. Even a strong practitioner of the undefeated realm couldn't withstand it after being washed by the sword intent. With a muffled sound, dozens of dents appeared on the gray robe. Martial Uncle Zhua spat out a mouthful of blood. Zhao Liu shook her wrist, and the sword rope wrapped around his neck, pulling him to the cliff wall. Her legs, which had been crossed, kicked out like lightning and hit his back. Martial Uncle's was spat out another mouthful of blood. Zhao Liu pushed against his back with her legs, falling backward, the sword rope in her hand pulled straight. She wanted to use her physical strength to cut off his head. The sword rope trembled violently and moved slowly on Martial Uncle's body, making an ear-piercing sound of friction. "You're indeed Zhao Liu, but you can't kill me like this." Martial Uncle's panted. The gray flying sword blocked the sword rope around his neck. He was very angry that he was forced into such a difficult situation by a junior of a lower realm. But as he said, Zhao Liu couldn't kill him with this. The gap between realms couldn't be made up with courage, wisdom, or other things most of the time. Blood kept flowing out of Zhao Liu's body. Because of the force, the flow was even faster than before. Her face grew paler, and her eyes dimmed. She knew that the moment she could no longer hold the sword rope would be the moment of death. At this moment, the clouds on the peak dispersed a little, and starlight fell. Martial Uncles looked at the scene in front of him and suddenly froze. Even though the sword rope was around his neck, his eyes were still fixed on it. A person had appeared in front of him, a young man in white. It was not because the young man in white was too beautiful that he could still be attracted in this life-or-death battle. He just couldn't figure out how the young man in white appeared. Martial Uncle Zhua was shocked, confused, and even a little panicked. Before he hurt the eagle, he had observed the surroundings and made sure there was no one else. In the following conversation in battle, he also made sure that there was no sound around the peak, breathing, heartbeat, or footsteps. The young man in white seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, but it also seemed that he had been standing here all along. The question was, if he had been standing here all along, why didn't he see him? Why didn't he notice him at all? Was he a strong man of the state of free travel, who could completely hide his existence between heaven and earth? No, even a strong man of the state of free travel couldn't do that. Was he a ghost? Martial Uncle Zhua thought of many things and possibilities in a very short time, but he couldn't figure out the answer. Jingjiu didn't give him more time to think and raised his hand. Martial Uncle Zhua felt a great danger. His pupils constricted, and he wanted to leave, but he was firmly locked by the sword rope and the legs behind him. Jingjiu's hand fell on Martial Uncle Zhua's neck. The sound of friction was unpleasant, and sparks flew everywhere, which was extremely beautiful. The whole process was very short. Martial Uncle's scream, and the sound of friction stopped abruptly. A light sound came. Martial Uncle's head fell like a ripe fruit. Zhao Liu's face was exposed, and so were her eyes, which were still as distinct as before. Blood gushed out from the neck cavity of the headless body, like fireworks in a grand ceremony, like a waterfall rising to the sky. The two looked at each other through the red blood all over the sky. Chapter 31. An undefeated state martial uncle of Bihu Peak died. It was said that he was murdered. The place where the martial uncle's body was found was by a stream. It was said that he looked miserable and his head was cut off. Undoubtedly, This was the most vicious incident that had happened in the 9 peaks of Aoyama in recent years. It was said that the martial uncle was trusted by the peak master of Bihu Peak and was highly valued. Now that the peak master of Bihu Peak was recovering from his injury, the disciples in the peaks were not in a stable mood. Now that such an incident had happened, it naturally caused great anger. Shanghai Peak was under great pressure. If it was a spy from another sect who sneaked into the 9 peaks, it would be Shanghai Peak's negligence. This was unlikely, because it was impossible for someone who could kill a master of the undefeated state to not disturb the formation of Aoyama. It was more likely that the martial uncle of Bihu Peak was killed by a fellow disciple. If this was the case, Shanghai Peak was responsible for monitoring all the peaks, so they would bear the brunt. Shanghai Peak sent out many caretakers and disciples to investigate the case, but they found no clues. There was evidence that night, whether it was the masters of other peaks who had a grudge against the deceased of Bihu Peak, or a few ruthless elders who had done evil deeds in the past. This incident seemed to be shrouded in layers of mystery. The disciples by the stream of sword washing were in low states, so they were naturally not involved in this matter. Shanghai Peak would not ask them when investigating the case, but they could also feel that something was wrong with the atmosphere recently. The immortal masters who were in charge of teaching obviously had something on their minds. When they found out the cause of the incident, they could not help but feel frightened and became silent. Lu Shui was a man of few words. Normally, he was even quieter than usual, so it was hard to notice him. But the Fat Ma Hua felt that something was wrong with him, because apart from being quieter, Lu Shui was often absent-minded when practicing the sword. In the past 2 days, he almost hurt himself several times, which was really rare. Ma Hua wanted to inquire about it, but he thought that Lu Shui was still a teenager, so it was normal for him to feel uneasy after hearing such a thing. Only a strange young girl, like Zhao Lei, wouldn't be affected by it, he thought while looking at the sword peak shrouded in clouds. That night, Lu Shui went to Jing Jiu's cave abode. He hadn't been there for a long time. Jing Jiu was a little surprised. Lu Shui's face was a little pale, and his eyes were a little red. It was obvious that he didn't sleep well. Jing Jiu thought he was worried about the inherited sword competition, so he patted his head and said, "You are a good match for Liang Wang Peak. They won't abandon you." Lu Shui raised his head and suddenly asked, "Young master, did you do it?" Jing Jiu grunted, but he couldn't tell if his voice was going up or down. Lu Shui looked at him blankly and said, "That night. I came, but you weren't here." Only then did Jing Jiu realize that Lu Shui had come to look for him that night. Lu Shui must have seen the sword token instead of him. He laughed and said, "Do you think I can kill that person? How could a sword-washing disciple, who didn't even have a sword, kill a swordsman in the state of the undefeated?" It was for this reason that the investigation of Shanghai Peak was far away from the stream of sword washing. Not to mention Jing Jiu, even those excellent disciples in Class A of the Hall of Sword Washing with a high state didn't receive any suspicious looks. Hearing Jing Jiu's words, Lu Shui looked a little perplexed. Yesterday, Big Brother Gu said that the broken neck of the dead senior uncle was very smooth. The killer should be a swordsman in the state of free travel, or he used a famous sword. I remember very clearly that you said that your specialty is severing. Young master, where did you go the night before yesterday? Young master, I'm really scared. Jing Jiu looked at Lu Shui's small face. For the first time, he found that Lu Shui's face could be so pale. Of course, he could hide it from Lu Shui. He could easily come up with many reasons to explain why he left the manor cave that night, even though he had never left the manor cave before. For example, he had an adventure on the Sword Peak, where he went to see the monkeys play, because he knew that Jing Jiu just needed a reason to feel relieved. But for some reason, he didn't do it. Yes. Oh, I killed that person. It became very quiet in the manor cave, and the sound of the flowing stream of sword washing could be heard clearly. Then, Lu Shui's breathing became more and more erratic. His face became paler and paler. Young master, who are you on earth? 3 years ago at the South Pine Pavilion, Lu Shui had asked Jing Jiu this question more than once. Today, he asked it again. He knew that Jingjiu had secrets, and that Jingjiu didn't want to get in touch with Liangwang Peak, so these secrets might be problematic. But he didn't expect that Jingjiu would kill a senior master of the sect. It doesn't matter who I am. You can report this to your senior master or your big brother. In fact, you should have done this a long time ago, Jingjiu said. He had also asked Lu Shisui this question more than once in the South Pine Pavilion. Lu Shisui said with his head lowered, I know your secrets because you never tried to hide it from me. Most of the time, you wanted to help me. For example, the breathing in the small village and the magic pill in the tea. These were all Jingjiu's secrets, but he benefited from them. You think too much, Jingjiu said with a smile. It was troublesome. You and I were together every day, and it was too troublesome to hide it from you. Just troublesome? Lu Shisui stood up and walked out of the manor cave, looking a bit pitiful. It had been 3 years since he left the village, and the boy had become a teenager. He was different after all. At the entrance of the cave, Lu Shisui stopped. Without turning around, he asked in a trembling voice, Is that senior master a bad person? Jingjiu lowered his head to read the Book of Swords and didn't answer the question. Lu Shisui stood at the entrance of the cave, unwilling to leave. After a long time, Jingjiu's voice finally sounded. From my point of view, of course he is a bad person. Lu Shisui left without saying anything. Jingjiu didn't think that Lu Shisui would tell on him. In order to return to Aoyama's sect, he had spent a whole year in that small village. Even though he would definitely run into unexpected situations, he still had enough countermeasures. Of course, it was also possible that he didn't want to think about this problem. Right now, he was thinking about something else. In the early morning, the sun was still on the other side of the peaks, and the sound of the sword cleansing stream was quiet. He looked at the stream and thought for a while. When the red sun jumped out of the peak, he thought for a while. Until noon, when the sun was blazing, he looked back at the peak that was covered in clouds all year round and thought again. I'd better go and have a look, he said to himself. He left the cave abode and followed the stream of sword washing toward the mountain peak. Every time he came out, he would attract a lot of attention and cause a lot of discussion. This time was no exception. Counting carefully, he had been in the inner sect for half a year, and this was the 3rd time he left the manor cave and appeared in front of people. It was rare to see someone as lazy or as autistic as him, even in the cultivation world that was used to being alone. When he walked past the stone wall at the end of the stream and continued toward the 9 peaks, more and more eyes fell on him, and the discussion became louder and louder. That direction should be the sword peak. Is that guy going to get a sword? The disciples who were practicing flying swords on the stream subconsciously stopped. Mahua looked at Jingjiu in the distance and murmured. Chapter 32. Many people knew that Jingjiu said he would take the sword of Senior Master Mo of Shuriwe Peak the first day he entered the inner gate. In the beginning, many people wondered if he would surprise the world like he did at the South Pine Pavilion. But as time passed, fewer and fewer people believed that he could do it. Even junior sister Yushan and the Lelong County disciple from the South Pine Pavilion no longer held any hope. Half a year had passed, but Jingjiu hadn't even been to the sword peak once, let alone retrieving a sword. This had long since become the most famous topic of conversation in the stream of sword washing. For those who didn't like Jingjiu, such as Shui Yongyi and those outstanding students in the A class, this was naturally the laughingstock of Jingjiu. Today, it seemed that Jingjiu was going to retrieve the sword. Time to retrieve the sword. Jingjiu is going to retrieve the sword. There were shouts everywhere in the Shi Jian Pavilion. Dozens of inner court disciples ran out. Lin Wuji was a little surprised. Then, he found that Master Mei Li had ended her class in advance and was riding her sword towards the sword peak. When Jingjiu walked up the sword peak, he didn't know that Mei Li and Lin Wuji had already arrived. What he didn't know was that when he walked up the sword peak, many sword-washing disciples, and even disciples from the other peaks, came to watch the show. He didn't expect that he would be mistaken for going to the sword summit to get a sword. Fortunately, he knew that it was daytime, so he didn't run like crazy like that night. Instead, he walked steadily. He quickly climbed up the cliff. His speed was not fast, but he did not slow down either. It was quiet at the foot of the Sword Peak. The deacons of Yunqing Peak shook their heads, shocked, speechless. The disciples' mouths were agape, unable to speak for a long time. In the beginning, it wasn't as quiet as it was now. Taunts and ridicule towards Jing Jiao could be heard from time to time. Yet, when they saw Jing Jiao walking among the peaks, their excitement was replaced by the sound of inhaling cold air. After an unknown period of time, the disciples finally came back to their senses and discussed nonstop. Isn't this his first time entering the Sword Peak? How could he walk so steadily? How is this possible? We've already passed the Eagle Beak Cliff. Doesn't that mean we've crossed 6,000 feet? How much further do you think he can go? Another 1,000 feet? He can't possibly walk into the clouds on his first try, right? Amazing. He really hid his strength. However, I heard that Martial Uncle Mo's sword is at the peak of the mountain. It should be very difficult to get it. Look, he's about to enter the clouds. He really entered the clouds. Jing Jiao did not know that there were so many spectators on the Sword Peak. Even if he knew, he wouldn't care. He would just walk at his own pace. Soon after, he walked into the clouds and could no longer be seen. He left behind a wave of exclamations at the bottom of the mountain, as well as a few sighs of dissatisfaction. How cool would it be if he stopped and waved before entering the clouds? Lin Wuji turned around and was about to return to the stream of sword washing when his eyes met Martial Aunt Mei Li's. Martial Uncle Mo indeed has a good eye. He looked at Senior Master Mei Li and said, "I'm sorry, but it looks like we have to fight for this child." A cold intent suddenly appeared on Senior Master Mei Li's beautiful face as she said, "I'll say it again. Look at the child's appearance. Of course he wants to enter our Qingrong Peak. Big Brother Mo is so ugly. How could he accept this child as his disciple?" Arriving at the top of the eastern foot of the Sword Peak, Jing Jiao found the cliff wall and halted his steps. It was daytime, so he could see it more clearly. The hole was only 3 feet deep, just enough for one person to sit cross-legged inside. Zhao Leu was sitting inside, just like she had 2 days ago. Her bleeding had stopped, but her face was pale, and it looked like she was badly wounded. Jing Jiao put down the large basket of wild fruits in his hand and said, "Eat this." He had asked the monkeys to pick these wild fruits before he left the manor cave. They tasted a bit sour and bitter, but they were good for nourishing the blood and energy. Then he took out a magic pill from his sleeve and placed it in front of her. Zhao Leu lifted her head and asked, "Why was the corpse discovered?" Jing Jiao was surprised. How did she know what had happened at the foot of the peak? If she had a helper on the 9 peaks, why didn't that person treat her wound? Zhao Leu seemed to know what he was thinking, saying, "I have my ways." Jing Jiao didn't ask further, because he didn't care about this matter. But Zhao Leu stared into his eyes, trying to get an answer. "I haven't killed anyone for a long time, so I've forgotten what to do next," Jing Jiao said. "And it's troublesome to deal with the corpse, so you just threw it by the stream?" asked Zhao Leu. "Otherwise," asked Jing Jiao. Zhao Leu thought this youth was a strange flower, even stranger than herself. "Who are you?" She, of course, knew he was Jing Jiao, the handsome Jing Jiao. But who was Jing Jiao? Was he a spy sent by the imperial court? Jing Jiao looked at her and asked with a smile, "Then what about you? Who are you?" Of course, he knew she was Zhao Leu, the one and only Zhao Leu. But who was Zhao Leu? Was she the reinforcements sent by the monkeys? Jing Jiao wasn't worried that Zhao Leu would expose him. If someone found out that she killed the senior uncle of Bihu Peak, she would be in trouble even if she was Zhao Leu. If she said that the senior uncle wanted to kill her, how many people would believe her? So this matter could only be kept a secret. Jing Jiao made sure that her wound was not serious, so he turned around and prepared to go down the mountain. At this moment, he suddenly remembered something and said, "I remember that I didn't bury people when I killed them." Zhao Leu asked, "Aren't you afraid of being found out?" "Why should I be? Afraid of revenge? Afraid of trouble? Revenge?" There were a few times in the beginning but no one dared to do it later, so it's not very troublesome. After saying this, Jingjiu left the sword peak. When he returned to the bottom of the peak and saw the regretful eyes of his peers, he remembered that he seemed to have forgotten something. Jingjiu's trip to the sword peak caused a great sensation on both sides of the sword washing stream. Though he didn't succeed in bringing back Senior Master Mo's fairy sword, he didn't hear any mocking or humiliating words in the hall of sword washing. The most he heard was a regretful sigh. Even those senior brothers who had washed their swords for many years and had a high cultivation state would speak respectfully when they talked about Jingjiu. It was because many people had seen him walk into the clouds the first time he climbed the sword peak. The case of the murder of the senior uncle of Bihu Peak was still under investigation in Shanghai to Peak, but few people mentioned it by the sword washing stream. No one had seen the senior uncle, so they naturally had no feelings for him. Besides, this matter was too far away from them. No one would believe that a sword-washing disciple could kill a sword fairy in the undefeated state. Except for that idiot Lu Shui. Chapter 33. Nobody came to ask about Jingjiu, nor did the swordsmen of Shanda Peak suddenly show up to take him to the gloomy and cold sword jail. Obviously, Lu Shui didn't tell anyone that he wasn't in the cave that night. He learned from junior sister Yushan that recently, Lu Shui had been cultivating even harder than before, even more so than in the past 3 years. Moreover, that youth had become even more taciturn, and no one knew what he was thinking about every day. All he knew was that his realm was improving at an unimaginable speed. Jingjiu roughly understood where Lu Shui's hard work and silence came from. He could only remain silent. The other sword-washing disciples were also training hard. Every day, many figures could be seen on the sword peak. Some of them were already able to walk to the periphery of the clouds. In the following days, there were disciples who succeeded in retrieving swords from the sword peak. From time to time, one could hear joyful laughter, strange cries, and painful cries by the sword-washing stream. The disciples naturally cherished the immortal swords that they had worked so hard to obtain. Loving them so much that they couldn't bear to part with them wasn't enough to describe it. Whether it was during classes or meals, they would always carry the swords with them. They would carefully learn from their senior brothers and sisters, tying the swords with the softest ribbon and carrying them on their backs. As for which kind of ribbon should be used, which kind of knot looked the best, and which put the least pressure on the sword body, naturally became the main topic of idle chatter in the Shi Jian Pavilion. There were even some disciples who would hug their swords in their arms, even when they went to the toilet or slept. It wasn't until Senior Master Mei Li of Qingrong Peak lost her temper that they calmed down a bit. Jingjiu had never left the cave residence. All these things were told to him by junior sister Yushan and a young man surnamed Yuan from Lelong Commandery. To him, these were all small episodes that didn't require too much attention. The encounter with Zhao Liu on the peak top that night and the killing of that Bihu Peak expert was just an interlude for him. In his opinion, Zhao Liu was smart enough to know that the two of them had secrets and should keep their distance, so this matter should end here. He didn't expect that there would be a deviation in his deduction. Thus, he became famous again, even more famous than before. A piece of news spread along the banks of the sword-washing stream. People who heard the news were extremely shocked. It was noisy in the Shi Jian Pavilion, and everyone was talking about it. Shuiyong, he let out a strange cry and shouted, "How is this possible?" Then he felt a little strange, as if he had had the exact same reaction when he was at the South Pine Pavilion. This news even alarmed Mei Li and the other immortal teachers in the Shi Jian Pavilion. This senior master of Qingrong Peak and Lin Wuji had high hopes for Jingjiu, but they didn't expect him to become famous so quickly. At the stone wall at the end of the stream, Ma Hua handed a towel to the soaked Lu Shui and said with a faint smile, "You know what? That young master of yours is famous again." Lu Shui's hand that was wiping his face stiffened. After a moment of silence, he raised his head and asked nervously, "What's wrong?" Zhao Liu ended her cultivation at the Sword Mountain and returned to the stream of sword washing. Ma Hua sighed with emotion It seems that she has really completed the tempered body of sword intent. Lu Shui was taken aback. Zhao Liu was the idol of all the regular disciples, as well as his, but he had never seen this legendary Big Sister. It was a big deal that Big Sister had ended her cultivation on the Sword Mountain, but what did it have to do with his young master? The problem is that Zhao Liu didn't go to the Hall of Sword Washing to visit the masters or her own manor cave after she left the peak, but went to Jing Jiu's manor cave instead. Ma Hua looked at a spot downstream and said sentimentally, "She is talking to Jing Jiu now." Lu Shui felt relieved, thinking that his young master was extraordinary and only a genius like Big Sister Liu would be willing to talk to him. Thinking that Jing Jiu usually didn't talk much when they were together, he suddenly felt a sense of inferiority. Ma Hua pulled back his gaze and glanced at him, asking, "Don't you want to go and have a look?" Lu Shui shook his head and spread the cotton towel on the rock, waiting for it to be dried by the sun. Then he walked back to the stream and continued to practice the sword art. Ma Hua narrowed his eyes as he looked at the thin figure on the stream. He didn't know what had happened to this little guy. In the last few days, Lu Shui had become more reticent and diligent, as if he had finally found a goal or was under some pressure. The sword art of Liangwang Peak was about persistence and perseverance. Lu Shui's performance should be a good thing, but Ma Hua felt something was wrong. Walking back to the natural pavilion surrounded by several green trees, Ma Hua asked, "Do you still think that Jing Jiu is a useless person?" Gu Han said emotionlessly, "Anyone who can't pick up a sword is a useless person, even if he is a genius in the eyes of the world." Ma Hua understood what he meant and said no more. The class by the stream of sword washing was over. Dozens of disciples came out of the hall of sword washing and came to the stream. Some of them were washing swords in the stream, some were washing fruits in the stream, and some were chatting casually. In fact, all of them were looking at the cliff on the other side of the stream. There was a stone platform between the cliffs, and behind it was a manor cave, which was no different from other manor caves on the cliff. At this moment, there were two vague figures in front of the manor cave. "Is it really Senior Sister Zhao? Are you sure?" Yu Kuan entered the inner gate with Senior Sister Zhao, and they spent dozens of days together in the Hall of Sword Washing. How could he be wrong? Senior Sister Zhao really went down the mountain? Then why is she there? Look, she is really talking to Jing Jiu. The disciples by the stream were talking in low voices, excited and nervous. For them, Zhao Liu was the most respectable senior sister, but also a fairy that they couldn't get close to. Everyone knew that Senior Sister Zhao was indifferent and taciturn. She treated everyone the same and kept a distance from them. She didn't even want to get close to Liangwang Peak, which wanted to recruit her. Then why did she come to see Jing Jiu after finishing her hard practice on the Sword Peak? The most important thing was that she was really talking to Jing Jiu. Was it possible that Jing Jiu had something extraordinary? A few days ago, he had shocked many people by flying into the clouds on the Sword Peak, but he didn't succeed in taking the sword, so it was not a big deal. I haven't seen Senior Brother Jing do anything in the past 2 years, but he always does something amazing at the critical moment. He is really good at hiding his strength. Young Yuan from Lelong Commandery said enviously while looking at the scene on the other side of the stream. At this moment, who didn't envy Jing Jiu? Is Senior Sister Zhao also an ordinary person? A disciple said with a puzzled face. The others asked him what he meant. The disciple raised his hand and made a gesture on his face. The others understood what he meant and laughed and scolded him. I got it. Shui Yong suddenly waved his arms and said indignantly, Jing Jiu must be practicing secretly every night and sleeping in the daytime, pretending to be calm. Otherwise, how could he walk into the clouds on the Sword Peak and get to know Senior Sister Zhao? I've seen so many people like him in the state school. He is so hypocritical. In the eyes of the disciples on the other side of the stream, Jing Jiu was the most envied person, but he still didn't talk much as usual. He was even lying on the bamboo chair. If the monkeys behind the cliff hadn't moved 2 big stones here, no one would know where Zhao Liu would sit. Have you recovered? Yes. Have you finished the tempered body of Swordwell? Yes. Jing Jiu didn't talk much, neither did Zhao Liu. He felt good about it. Lu Shui was also very nice, except that he was a bit naggy sometimes. He didn't have much experience in small talk. He thought the conversation was over, so he looked at the porcelain plate again, holding a grain of sand in his hand, thinking about where to put it. Zhao Lei didn't say anything. She closed her eyes and began to meditate under the sunlight, absorbing the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. Her injuries from that night were basically healed. The pill that Jingjiu gave her was very effective. However, after staying on the sword peak for more than a year, her tempered body of sword will have been greatly damaged. There were many tiny holes in her meridians, and the spirituality of her sword pellet was also affected. All of these needed time to slowly recover. After a long time, she opened her eyes and found that the sun was setting in the west. Jingjiu was still holding the grain of sand and looking at the porcelain plate, exactly the same posture as at the beginning. It seemed that only a moment had passed. Zhao Lei looked at him and felt that this young man was a bit unfathomable. The unfathomable here was not referring to his realm, but something else. He must be extraordinary to be able to have such terrifying patience. Jingjiu acted like he was playing chess. He couldn't decide which move to make. Zhao Lei's gaze fell on the porcelain plate and the pile of fine sand. After a long time, she said, "Interesting." Jingjiu raised his head and glanced at her, saying, "Interesting." He didn't expect that this little girl could understand his meaning. "It's too difficult," Zhao Lei said. "I'm leaving." It was obvious that even though she thought it was interesting, she didn't think that the most precious time should be spent on this kind of thing. "Okay," Jingjiu said. After a few days, Zhao Lei came again. Seeing the sword light falling in front of Jingjiu's manor cave, the disciples on the other side of the stream were still shocked. "She's here." Jingjiu found that her hair was still short and messy, covered with a layer of dust, like a clump of weeds in the wilderness. He didn't know if it was because the image was too clear in his sword discernment, but he suddenly felt a bit thirsty. Without Lu Shui to make tea, his teapot was filled with the mountain spring that the monkeys fetched every day. The teapot was on the stone table, and he was sitting in the bamboo chair. He was about to reach out his hand, but he remembered that there was someone beside him, so he naturally glanced at Zhao Lei. Zhao Lei asked, "What do you mean?" Jingjiu said, "Pour me a cup of water." "No," Zhao Lei said. "Oh." Jingjiu realized that she wasn't Lu Shui. The cool mountain spring tasted as good as tea, he thought while drinking the water in the cup. Chapter 34. I don't know how you killed him that night, but I know your sword source is very abundant, not weaker than mine. Zhao Lei continued while looking at him. I don't understand how someone as lazy as you could do it. She had been preparing for cultivation under the watchful eyes of the Aoyama sect since she was sensible, or even since she was born. Every morning when she opened her eyes, she would start to train her body and meditate. She didn't slack off even for a moment after she came to the Aoyama sect. It could be said that she was cultivating with every breath she took. She had heard of Jingjiu and knew that he was famous for his laziness, but she thought it was a misinformation after what had happened on the peak top that night. It wasn't until she saw him with her own eyes that she found he was indeed very lazy. She had never seen such a lazy person who wasted his talent like this. What she didn't understand was how such a lazy person could cultivate such abundant sword source. She wanted to know the answer to this question, but she was even more eager to know the true identity of Jingjiu. "Do you know why I'm willing to come to the Aoyama sect to learn the sword work?" Jingjiu said while looking at her. "It's because this place doesn't care how the disciples cultivate. They can cultivate however they want." He added in his mind that it was also because he was familiar with this place. Zhao Lei said, "I don't know what you want to cultivate or what you want to hide, but you will become the center of attention if you do this." Jingjiu said, "I think it's too troublesome to hide it on purpose." Zhao Lei pressed, "Even if your secret will be discovered, there is no secret that can be kept forever, and the sharp awl in the pocket can't be hidden forever." Jingjiu said, "I've had similar experiences. The sun rises every day, but it's impossible for the sky to be covered with dark clouds all the time. If you always try to prevent the people on the ground from seeing your brilliance, it's a very difficult and even stupid thing to do. Zhao Liu turned her head slowly to look at him, asking uncertainly, "You compare yourself to the sun?" Jing Jiu said, "It's just an analogy. Many big sisters on Qingrong Peak are talking about me in private, saying that I'm very narcissistic." After a moment of silence, Zhao Liu said, "I don't think I'm as good as you." Jing Jiu said, "I think you should understand what I mean." Zhao Liu remained silent. She knew what Jing Jiu wanted to express. She was a natural-born Taoist seed, a genius in the art of the sword, and was favored by the Aoyama sect. Ever since she was born, she had received countless gazes. After entering the inner gate, she chose the tempered body of sword will, which was a difficult and dangerous cultivation method. That way, she could hide in the depths of the clouds of the sword peak and not be seen by others. She was silent and looked stubborn. Jing Jiu raised his hand and stroked her hair. Zhao Liu raised her eyebrows and glared at him with murderous intent. Jing Jiu pulled back his hand and said calmly, "You should go wash your hair. It's just cultivation. You don't have to make yourself look so miserable." Zhao Liu shook her head forcefully, the dust falling down from her head. She looked like a puppy who had just come home after playing outside for a whole day. "I forgot." Having said that, she rode her sword toward her manor cave on the cliff wall. Jing Jiu felt that he had forgotten something as well. It didn't take long before Zhao Liu came back. She had changed into a new robe, her short black hair still dripping with water. The manor cave she lived in was much better than the regular disciples. It was located at the top of the cliff wall, and there was a hot spring drawn by the immortal masters of Shilai Peak. Jing Jiu glanced at her hair. Zhao Liu said, "The sword source is used to kill people. How can it be used for such a thing?" As Jing Jiu was about to say something, he suddenly turned his head to look at the sky in the east. Several extremely sharp whistling sounds rang out in the sky. The clouds were torn apart, leaving several straight lines of clouds, which looked like arrows. With a loud boom, the middle part of the clouds surged uneasily. A moment later, a sword light broke through the clouds and arrived above the sword-washing stream. The sword light was pure and bright, of a very high level, exuding an awe-inspiring sword will. The driver of the sword should be a swordsman with a profound cultivation state. But for some reason, the flying sword was very unstable. It was crooked, like a drunken villager or a wild crane that was so scared that it did not know where to go. The sword light traveled between the cliffs by the sword-washing stream, sometimes going up, sometimes going down. An extremely shrill sound came from the sword, spreading in all directions. Even if there's no one, what about two? If there's no one, what about two? The shout of the driver of the sword reverberated in the valley. The horrible sword will fell from time to time, stirring up the water in the stream. Clear marks appeared on the cliffs, and crushed stones fell down. Sword lights rose from the peaks in the distance, indicating that the personal disciples were on their way. Under the summons of their masters, the sword-washing disciples by the stream hid in the sword-washing pavilion. Hearing the shrill sound in the sky and seeing the broken trees and rocks between the cliffs after being swept by the sword will, the disciples turned pale and panicked. What was going on? Who was that person? Why was he so crazy and so horrible? Zhao Liu walked to the edge of the cliff and looked at the crazy sword light in the sky, her eyes full of vigilance and hostility. Jing Jiu looked at her in silence, wondering what the source of these two emotions was. The sword lights from the peaks stopped when they were about 10 miles away from the sword-washing stream. They must have received an order. That crazy sword light was too fast, and the sword rider was too strong. The ordinary direct disciples of the peaks were no match for it at all, and would only increase the number of casualties. Therefore, the hundreds of sword lights only guarded the periphery, forming several sword formations to protect themselves, and, at the same time, to prevent that crazy sword rider from escaping. After the sword formations of the disciples were formed, the sky and earth suddenly changed color. The clouds scattered in all directions, and a square-shaped iron sword fell down from the sky. The square-shaped iron sword grew longer in the wind and became a dome of more than 30 feet, pressing down on the crazy flying sword and pushing it to a mountainous area a few miles away. The booming sounds, like real thunder, kept coming from under the dome of the iron sword. The pebbles on the mountainous area were shaken and jumped up from the ground, rolling on the ground as if they had become living creatures. The horrible shaking came to the sword-washing stream from afar. The water in the stream was boiling, breaking into pieces after hitting the cliffs. Many fish were killed by the shaking. An hour later, the fighting finally stopped, and the iron sword quieted down, like a real iron house. It was unclear whether the person covered by the iron sword was dead or not. Countless dead fish floated to the surface of the stream, looking like the richest merchants in Xiaoga City, throwing out a dozen baskets of silver coins. The cliff that was slashed open by that crazy sword slowly slid down and entered the river. Countless huge waves were stirred up, and who knew how many people sighed. "Is this the power of the broken sea state?" Zhao Liu said, while looking at the scene in the distance. Jing Jiu walked to her side and said, "Yuan Qijing hasn't fought in person for many years. I think he has probably reached the consummate state of the broken sea and entered the heavenly arrival state a long time ago." Zhao Liu shot him a glance. If what he said was true, the Aoyama sect would have another figure in the heavenly arrival state, which would shock the whole land. Chapter 35. The disciples by the stream of sword-washing didn't dare to talk about the big event that happened that day, but they still talked about it in private. Soon, the news spread, and they learned that the horrible flying sword was the Tide Sword, and the crazy swordsman was Lei Poyan, the Peak Master of Bihu. It was said that the Peak Master of Bihu was assassinated by the underworld devil and the assassins of Bulo Lin in Xiaoga City and was seriously injured, and now he was healing somewhere. Who would have thought that he would appear in front of the masters and disciples in such a crazy state, as if he was possessed by the devil? What on earth happened? Nobody gave an answer. The incident had gradually died down. The cliffs cut by Lei Poyan's sword lights were repaired by the formation masters of Shilai Peak. Looking at them with the naked eye, one couldn't find any marks on them. After one night, it seemed that the incident had never happened. But those mournful and crazy words still reverberated among the peaks. Even if there is no one, what about two? If there is no one, what about two? This sentence had no beginning and no end. What did it mean? No one could explain it clearly. Thinking of the mysterious death of the senior master of Bihu Peak a few days ago, the whole thing became more and more weird. Jing Jiu knew the meaning of this sentence, and also knew why Lei Poyan couldn't forget it before his death. Standing by the cliff with his hands behind his back and looking at the dark sky, he felt that this place was like an old well, with a faint sense of weariness between his eyebrows. It was bone-piercingly cold on the top of Shangda Peak. No matter what state one was in, one had to stay absolutely sober. Yuan Qijing walked to the depth of the cave residence and looked down at the bottom of the well, without saying anything for a long time. Frost and snow covered the cave walls, and his hair also had a streak of white, but it had nothing to do with the cold. Last night, in order to suppress Lei Poyan, he used the swordsmanship he learned from the outside world when he was young. The effect was remarkable, but the sword source was also consumed so much that it would take at least 100 days to recover. More than 30 disciples and caretakers of Shangda Peak knelt behind him, waiting for his decision. As the number 2 figure of Aoyama's sect, he had the right to decide the future of many people, even their life and death, but he didn't do so. Instead, he raised his hand to signal the crowd to disperse. Someone who could release Lei Poyan from the depths of the heavily guarded sword prison was obviously not an ordinary person. These disciples and deacons could do nothing about it. The question was, why did the other party release Lei Poyan? Looking in the direction of Tianguang Peak outside the cave, Yuan Qijing wondered if Gu Qing wanted to kill him with a borrowed knife, or if Gu Qing was testing him again. What happened that day, we still have to investigate. We can't stop. He spoke slowly with a hoarse voice. The deacons and disciples had already left the cave, and only his most trusted junior brother, Qian, was still here. Qian said, "There is news from Liangwang Peak, but it's hard to be sure, and I don't believe it. Since there's news, of course we should investigate further," but after a pause, Yuan Qijing said, "The day of the inherited sword competition is coming. Don't make it too big." Hearing about the inherited sword competition, Qian thought of something and asked, "That Jingjiu really doesn't need to be watched again?" No matter who it was, as long as he could make Zhao Liu take a liking to him, he was qualified to get more attention. Seeing his big brother remain silent, Qian said with a bitter smile, "The number of disciples who are willing to come to our Shanghai Peak has decreased over the years." The inherited sword competition was an occasion for the 9 peaks of Aoyama to select the inherited sword disciples. But for those excellent and potential disciples, it was also an opportunity to choose a sword peak. For many years, the Tianguang Peak, where the sect master lived, was the place where most disciples wanted to go. Shanghai Peak was very powerful, and its sword style was top-notch. Yuan Qijing was the big brother of the sect master, but the number of disciples applying for the inherited sword had decreased over the years. Liangwang Peak could select talents from among the disciples of other peaks, but they seldom chose their candidates in advance. Shirihue Peak was more inclined toward academic research, and Shilai Peak was in charge of the affairs of the Green Mountain, so the number of disciples who signed up was relatively small. However, the number of disciples of Shangda Peak willing to inherit swords was even less than that of Bihu Peak and Yunxing Peak, not to mention Qingrong Peak. Why? Was it because the atmosphere of Shanghai Peak was too gloomy, or because the sword jail was too gloomy, or because all the young disciples were afraid of them? That lazy bum, Yuan Qijing sneered, saying, "Those little guys on Liangwang Peak won't let him go." Qian didn't understand what his big brother meant by letting him go. Yuan Qijing said, "Don't think about other things. Try to take over Bihu Peak first." Time went on slowly but surely. It didn't take long for the early winter to arrive. It was said that at the request of Qingrong Peak, the sect master agreed to open an opening in the Great Formation of Aoyama, so that the cold wind and snowflake from the outside could pour into the 9 peaks. Looking at the snowflakes dancing in the air, Jingjiu had another feeling that he had forgotten something. He tried to figure it out, but found nothing. The feeling grew stranger and stranger. After coming back to Aoyama from that small village, he had many feelings he hadn't experienced before, such as boredom, interest, and forgetfulness. It was impossible for him to forget, so the reason for this feeling could only mean that he had avoided something unconsciously. Why? Was it because he was used to such a lazy life? On the day the first snowfall fell, Zhao Liu came again. She had been meditating in the manor cave for dozens of days, and had perfectly digested what she had obtained on the sword peak. Even the minor injuries on her body had been healed. The white snowflakes fell on the cliff walls, on the courtyard walls, and on her body. In the white world, her thick black eyebrows were very distinct, just like her eyes. Seeing the sword light land in front of Jing Jiu's manor cave, the people on the other side of the sword washing stream sighed. "Big sister is here again. Why is she here again? The 7th time, the 7th time." The disciples beat their chests and stamped their feet, or cupped their hearts with their hands, disappointed and grieved at the choice of their idol. "I was born on Liu, so I'm called this." Glancing at her bracelet, Zhao Liu said, "I was born in a heavy snowfall." Jingjiu wondered if she was going to have a chat with him. He had chatted with Lu Shui and with Zhao Liu a few times. Though he was still not used to why people would spend their leisure time chatting, at least he had accepted the existence of such a thing, and he knew that a chat should start with a topic. He was not good at finding topics to chat about, and he only knew one thing about Zhao Liu. "Which peak will you choose for the inherited sword competition?" The 9 peaks would select their favorite disciples at the inherited sword competition, but if that disciple was too popular, the situation would be reversed. A talented girl like Zhao Liu naturally had enough space to choose. Which peak would she choose for the inherited sword competition was something that the Aoyama sect and even the whole cultivation world were curious about. But for various reasons, no one would ask her this question in front of her. until Jingjiao felt that a chat was about to start. Zhao Lei didn't answer this question. Looking at those peaks in the wind and snow, she didn't say anything. In the eyes of her peers and masters, she was a bit arrogant, taciturn, and indifferent. But in Jingjiao's eyes, she was like a stubborn little girl, somewhat pitiful. Jingjiao raised his hand to rub her short hair, but then put it down and said, "Don't think too much." Zhao Lei withdrew her sight and looked at him, saying, "I'm going to Sword Peak to make the final preparation." The so-called preparation was, of course, for the inherited sword competition. She came here against the wind and snow to say this to him, just to say goodbye. Farewells were often very sad, but it didn't apply to Jingjiao. "See you then," he said. On the long road of cultivation, there were many encounters and reunions, but most of them were farewells and then never to see each other again. He had seen too many joys and sorrows, life and death, so he could be very indifferent now. In front of time, what else could he do but be indifferent? Zhao Lei left the stream of sword washing and went to Sword Peak. She didn't ride her sword, not because the small cyan sword was seriously damaged, but because of other considerations. Chapter 36. Zhao Lei knew what Guhan wanted to ask, but she didn't want to answer him, so she kept walking forward. "Stop," Guhan said in a low voice. He took a deep breath to control his emotions. Looking at her back, he said, "All the peaks are old and decrepit. The future of Aoyama depends on us." Zhao Lei didn't let him finish. "You are wrong. The future of Aoyama depends on me, not you." Having said that, she kept walking toward the Sword Peak and soon disappeared in the wind and snow. Guhan looked at the smaller black spot in the wind and snow and thought, what about Jingjiao? Why are you paying attention to him? The wind and snow suddenly became chaotic, and the flying sword broke through the air. He stepped onto the sword and flew against the wind, turning into a puff of white smoke. Floating upwards, Guhan soon arrived at a beautiful mountain peak in the southwest direction. The peak was beautiful, but the sharp sword lights could be seen everywhere on the cliff plateau, full of murderous intent and blood intent. Even the snowflakes falling from the sky were melted into green smoke. This was the second peak of Aoyama, Liangwang Peak. Here were the best disciples from all the peaks. Most of them had reached the state of the undefeated, and a few of them had even entered the state of free travel. Guhan liked this feeling very much. Like most of the young disciples on Liangwang Peak, he didn't like the behavior of the other peaks, including the inherited sword competition. In their eyes, this was just a senseless act of the peaks to continue their inheritance and snatch talents, which was meaningless except for causing serious internal friction. The sword lights disappeared in the manor cave on the top of Liangwang Peak. "We can't keep watching like this. I don't know why Leia doesn't like us," Guhan said while looking at the back of that person. "I'll talk to young sister. You have to make sure that nothing bad will happen to Qing and Shui." That person didn't turn around and asked, "Besides, I want to know what you think of Jingjiao now." After a moment of silence, Guhan said, "I don't like him." That person turned around. His face was handsome and his expression was mild. He was Guinan Shan, the principal disciple of the sect master of Aoyama, and he was also the chief disciple of Liangwang Peak. Mahua has already proven that his views are correct. Guinan Shan smiled and said, "But I still support what you're doing. If he can't stand the test of time, it doesn't matter how talented he is. That kid has been humiliated by you several times, but he doesn't even dare to draw his sword. How can he defend the Tao and fight for Aoyama in the future?" Guhan said indifferently, "That guy doesn't even have a sword. How could he draw his sword?" The snowfall became heavier and heavier, and then gradually disappeared. The withered grass and branches turned green again. It was the beginning of spring again. The inherited sword competition was about to begin. It was said that Zhao Lei had finished her hard practice in the Sword Peak and returned, but no one had seen her, including in Jingjiao's cave residence. For the Aoyama sect, the inherited sword competition was a very important event, so all parties attached great importance to it. Seats had been arranged at the end of the stream of sword washing in advance. There were several huge rocks moved here by the immortal masters of Shilai Peak by their magic to serve as platforms. The huge rocks were so wide that they could hold thousands of people. White clouds and the shallow water between the cliffs flowed along with them, adding to the feeling of a fairyland. The ordinary disciples by the stream practiced their lessons in silence and nervously, and they couldn't help but look up at the sky once in a while. The senior brothers of Liangwang Peak and the masters of other peaks in Jiaoga City had returned one after another. The most eye-catching were the representatives of various sects who had come to watch the competition. A dozen monks from the Guochang Temple had come, and a few imperial officials from Jiaoga City had come. Shui Yu Nunnery and the Platonist sect, which were on good terms with the Aoyama sect, had sent their elders and other important figures. It was said that even the windy Broadsword Church in the far north had sent someone. The inner sect disciples, who had been washing their swords by the stream for many years, had all signed up for the competition as long as they were confident. Zhao Liu and Lu Shui, who had natural Tao quality, were naturally the focus of everyone's attention. It was said that even an elder of the Platonist sect had inquired about Lu Shui. As for Zhao Liu, she was the center of attention. If it were not for the inconvenience, Shui Yu Nunnery would have already gone to find her. Everyone wanted to know which peak Zhao Liu would choose in the inherited sword competition. The answer to this riddle would also solve another riddle that had troubled the Aoyama sect for many years. Before Zhao Liu was born, the Aoyama sect had predicted that she had natural Tao quality and had been protecting her secretly until now. Which important figure had done this? In addition to Zhao Liu and Lu Shui, there were more than 10 disciples who had also received much attention. These disciples all performed very well in the process of sword washing, and 3 of them, like Lu Shui, were chosen by Liangwang Peak in advance. Since the year before last, they had been taught by Gu Han in the A class. Among them, a disciple named Gu Qing had the highest state and was highly valued by the sect. If nothing unexpected happened, this disciple, named Gu Qing, would definitely inherit the sword smoothly. Gu Qing was not famous because he had been learning swordsmanship in Liangwang Peak as a sword boy and rarely appeared by the stream of sword washing. So he was a bit mysterious. In the eyes of some people who knew the inside story, Gu Qing's state was even slightly higher than Zhao Liu's, and he should be the strongest among the disciples of this generation, because he was the sword boy of Guanan Shan, the chief disciple of Liangwang Peak, and he was Gu Han's younger brother. Before the inherited sword competition began, the Aoyama sect had a very important matter to solve. That was the inheritance of the Peak Master of Bihu Peak. The death of the former Peak Master of Bihu Peak, Lei Poyan, was a secret, and it was an internal affair of the Aoyama sect, so it was carried out in a very low-key manner. Except for the head of the Aoyama sect and the Peak Masters, no one else watched the battle, not to mention the envoys of various sects who came to watch the competition. At night, a sword light shone on the 9 peaks. The sword was swept between heaven and earth. The great formation of Aoyama was activated, and the North Guard opened his eyes and swallowed several beams of starlight. Finally, the winner was decided. A secluded elder of Bihu Peak defeated Qi Yin of Shangda Peak and successfully took over the position of the Peak Master. The 9 peaks of Aoyama had already woken up in the morning light. At the end of the stream, countless voices came faintly. Jing Jiu glanced in that direction and walked to the other side of the stream. He came to the hall of sword washing and knocked on the door. Everybody went to the stone wall at the end of the stream. The hall of sword washing was so quiet that it should be empty. Lin Wuji didn't leave, as if he had been waiting for Jing Jiu. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said to Jing Jiu with a smile. Jing Jiu said, "I'm used to doing what I have to do today." Lin Wuji opened a register he had prepared and handed over a pen. Jing Jiu took the pen and wrote down his name on the register. "Senior Master Mo really appreciates you. For the sake of me waiting for you here, please consider him." Lin Wuji patted Jing Jiu's shoulder and said, "Though he is indeed not good-looking," Jing Jiu said after some thought, "I really don't care about beauty or ugliness." Lin Wuji sighed while looking at Jingjiu's face, thinking that he was right. Nobody was as good-looking as Jingjiu. Jingjiu walked toward the outside of the hall of sword washing. Lin Wuji collected the register and was about to send it to Shuriwei Peak for the record. He suddenly thought of something while looking at Jingjiu's back. Where's the sword? Why don't you go and get the sword? At the end of the stream of sword washing, both sides of the stream were full of disciples waiting for the inherited sword competition. There were many figures on both sides of the cliff wall that was a few thousand feet high, probably from the 9 peaks. Above the cliff wall was a patch of cloud and fog, making it impossible to see what was going on inside. The important figures of the Aoyama sect and the envoys of other sects who came to watch the competition must be among them. Who would Shuei Nunnery send this year? Young Sister Lien wouldn't come in person. Would it be her disciple? Looking at the foggy cliff, Jingjiu thought of some old acquaintances, which was rare. It was quite crowded by the stream, with people everywhere. Big Brother Jing here. Young Sister Yushan stood up and waved at Jingjiu, indicating that she had found a good spot for him. Jingjiu took a look and found that spot was indeed a good place to watch the competition, but there were too many people there. He preferred quietness and didn't like crowds, so he didn't want to go to crowded places. His line of sight naturally fell on the quietest place by the stream. It wasn't a remote place. There was a large green rock in the stream closest to the cliff wall. It was very quiet because there was a lonely figure on the bluestone. Zhao Leiyu was there. No disciple dared to get too close to her. Jingjiu walked over casually and sat down by her side. Chapter 37. Zhao Leiyu glanced at him and said, "You're here." Jingjiu nodded and looked at a conspicuous place on the other side of the stream. A dozen young disciples were standing there, calm and confident. They were all the students of the A class taught by Guhan. Jingjiu only knew Lu Shisui, so he didn't know there were 2 new faces. Jingjiu glanced at him. Lu Shisui turned his face away. When the disciples looked around, they didn't know they were also being observed. On the cliffs, on the huge stone pillars, and on the top of the mountain covered by clouds, many eyes fell on the stream, and many people were taking notes with pen and paper. The owners of those eyes, pens, and papers were all important figures in the 9 peaks. They would decide which disciple would be chosen to inherit the sword, and which disciple would be given up. Aoyama sect seemed to be lax in its management of the inner disciples, just like the outer disciples, allowing them to study the sword scripts themselves. In fact, all the peaks had been secretly watching the disciples' performance during the sword washing process, so they had a clear understanding of each disciple's temperament, inclination, state, and strength. We don't need to consider Gu Qing. He will definitely go back to Liangwang Peak. Lu Shisui's situation is different. Although he will definitely be invited to Liangwang Peak, he may be willing to learn sword from another peak first. Qi Yunyang's state is a bit unstable, but he is quite talented in sword riding. He can be moved up. We should try. As for Sikong Amin, I've already talked to his mother. It's through the Platonic sect. His mother promised that if we choose him, he will come to us. Shui Yong, he will probably attend the next inherited sword competition. His granduncle said that if we choose him next time, he can help us persuade Qi Feiying. Qi Feiying has been learning sword from senior brother Guhan in the A class for the past 2 years. I'm afraid he won't be persuaded so easily. Again, we won't stop him from going to Yangwang Peak in the future, but he has to go as a disciple of our peak. Then we can move his position forward and place him behind Sikong Amin. Similar discussions took place among the cliffs. The masters and direct disciples of the 9 peaks looked at the young people by the stream and kept deducing all kinds of possibilities. They wrote down one name after another on the paper. Some names would be crossed out, and some would be moved to the front. The atmosphere was very tense. This was the inherited sword competition of Aoyama sect. Not every peak would be able to choose a disciple to inherit their sword, because they would very likely have to compete with other peaks. Among the 9 peaks of Aoyama, Tingguang Peak held the most special position. Usually, they would not reject the disciples they picked. Shanghai Peak was in an awkward situation. fewer and fewer young disciples were willing to take the initiative to choose. Liangwang Peak could choose disciples from other peaks at any time, so they didn't have to make a decision at the inherited sword competition. However, the situation this year was a bit different. The disciple named Gu Qing would go to Liangwang Peak directly. In order to prepare for the plum meeting in a few years, how could someone like Guanan Shan let Zhao Liu and Lu Shisui go? As a result, the choices of Yunqing Peak and Bihu Peak became even smaller. They had to choose carefully and make all kinds of plans in advance. Guanan Shan was the principal disciple of the sect master and also the chief disciple of Liangwang Peak. Over the years, he had led the young disciples to kill demons and devils in the world and fought bloody battles with the demons of the underworld and the monsters in the north. However, he didn't have a cold-blooded aura. On the contrary, he had a mild temperament. He was a man of great talent and vision and had a broad view. He didn't like or dislike many things in the world. Looking at the two figures, one standing and the other sitting on the green rock, he said regretfully, "It looks like I can't do it." There were two meanings in this statement. A few days ago, after Zhao Liu returned from the Sword Peak, he had a long and serious talk with her. But in the end, Zhao Liu didn't promise to join Liangwang Peak. As for the second meaning, it naturally meant that Jing Jiu still failed to obtain the sword and could not participate in this inherited sword competition. Even if it works, I don't think it will work, Guhan said coldly. Ma Hua laughed. Some fine lines appeared on his chubby face. No means no, he said. So the final conclusion was that it was impossible. Jing Jiu couldn't. Lin Wuji walked over from the bottom of the cliff. Guanan Shan nodded. Lin Wuji also nodded. Both of them were the direct disciples of the sect leader, but for some reason, they seemed a little cold. Lin Wuji suddenly stopped and said, "Jing Jiu signed up." After a moment of silence, Guanan Shan said, "That's a good thing." Guhan said coldly, "What is this guy trying to do now?" Ma Huan narrowed his eyes, still smiling innocently, but a streak of cold light flashed across his eyes. Senior Master Mo has always wanted him. Now it seems that his vision is indeed much better than that of us juniors. Lin Wuji said, while looking at him. Guanan Shan said, "I also have high hopes for this young man." "Really? I don't think so." Lin Wuji glanced at Guhan and said with a faint smile, "Junior brother Gu just wants to sharpen him." Guanan Shan said, "He is too proud. Moderate pressure will help him grow." Lin Wuji said with emotion, "After so many years, I still can't get used to your way of talking to yourself." Guanan Shan said, "That's because you have never understood your student." Lin Wuji raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "I'd like to hear the details." Guanan Shan looked at the green stone in the stream and said, "The so-called laziness is actually a kind of attitude. He has no love for anything in the world and is condescending. This kind of extreme pride means nothing to our Aoyama sect and to the people in the world. If he can't clearly understand this, he is not qualified to come to our Liangwang Peak." Lin Wuji said with a slight mockery, "Have you never thought that he might not want to go to Liangwang Peak at all? What's the point of doing this except to make him unhappy? It is an honor for every disciple of Aoyama to be a disciple of Liangwang Peak. He will understand this one day." Guanan Shan looked at him and said gently, "Junior brother, if you are not unwilling to be defeated by my sword, shouldn't you be standing by my side now?" Lin Wuji looked at him in silence and suddenly said, "I think you may be disappointed today and twice." The green stone in the stream was very conspicuous. Many people fixed their eyes on it. Everyone was paying attention to Zhao Liu, but a lot of attention was drawn to the person next to her. The youth in white sat on the green stone, his lazy look very attractive because he was so good-looking. "Is this Jing Jiu? He's indeed very good-looking." "Fourth sister, did you really not see him when you went to the South Pine Pavilion 2 years ago? That's a pity." The female disciples of Qingrong Peak discussed excitedly while looking at the stream. This was the first time they had seen Jing Jiu. Though they had heard many rumors about him, they didn't know until they saw him in person that they knew he was famous. Jing Jiu was so good-looking. Will he participate in the inherited sword competition today? The disciples of Qingrong Peak looked at Senior Master Meili hopefully. Meili shook her head and said, maybe next time. The disciples of Qingrong Peak were somewhat disappointed. Meili felt the same way. Jing Jiao's sleeves moved with the wind, but it was obvious that he didn't hide the sword in them. It seemed that the miracle didn't happen, and he still didn't get that sword. Meili was more concerned about Zhao Lei's choice. Among the 9 peaks of Aoyama, Qingrong Peak and Shilai Peak had the most female disciples, especially the former, which was mostly made up of female swordsmen. In her opinion, Zhao Lei, a rare female with natural Dao quality, should naturally come to Qingrong Peak to inherit the sword. Of course, she thought a handsome youth like Jing Jiao should also come to Qingrong Peak. The gentle wind blew away the clouds and fog, revealing a corner of the curtain. A clear voice came from behind the curtain. Little Leu still didn't agree. Meili said respectfully, yes, Peak Master. But I heard she didn't agree with anyone else, so we still have hope. Who is the youth in white beside her? That's Jing Jiao. Chapter 38. The inherited sword competition began. The first one to stand out was a sword-washing disciple named Chunlin. Chunlin had been an inner sect disciple for 7 years, and he had successfully obtained a sword 5 years ago. But it wasn't until this year that he finally reached the state of perfect preservation and was qualified to participate in the inherited sword competition. Years of cultivation and waiting had given him a calmness that didn't match his age. He didn't care about the surrounding gazes and the pressure of being the first one to perform, and focused on his performance. A cold sword light left his sleeve, leaving a clear mark on the stone wall where the water was dripping, and then turned back. Before the flying sword could get close to him, he leapt onto the sword lightly and started to ride it back and forth between the cliffs, showing that he was very familiar with it. It was quiet on the cliff. The stone platform on the high cliff was surrounded by clouds and fog. The messenger of the Platonist sect, the guests from Ozawa, the representatives of Zhaoga City, the principal justice of the Guochang Temple, Shuei Nunnery, who had always been on good terms with the Aoyama sect, and a few representatives of the sword sects were sitting in their respective seats, keeping silent and not saying a word. This was the first time that the Mirror sect had sent a representative to watch the inherited sword competition of the Aoyama sect. The messenger didn't have much experience, so he didn't notice the silence on the cliff. Seeing the disciple, named Chun Lin, riding his flying sword skillfully and flying back and forth between the peaks, he couldn't help but admire him and applaud him. Chun Lin landed back on the rocks in the stream. Elder He of Shuriwe Peak, who was in charge of the inherited sword competition, looked at him and asked emotionlessly, "Which peak do you want to inherit the sword from?" Chun Lin's expression finally became nervous, and he said in a slightly dry voice, "This disciple doesn't have the ability to choose." As he spoke, he looked at the place where the masters of the peaks gathered, with hope and uneasiness in his eyes. At the inherited sword competition, each master of the 9 peaks could only choose one disciple to inherit the sword, and the number was limited, so they had to be very cautious. Chun Lin knew that his cultivation state wasn't outstanding among his peers, so he didn't expect to be fought over by the peaks, and only hoped that one peak would choose him. No sound came from the cliff, and it was still quiet. As time went by, the silence turned into awkwardness. By the stream, the disciples who weren't qualified to participate in the inherited sword competition looked at him with pity. Junior Sister Yushan turned her face away, too nervous to look. Amidst the deathly silence, Chun Lin maintained her calm on the surface. She raised her head with unimaginable determination, like a criminal awaiting her final sentence. He knew that if he lowered his head or appeared to be a little depressed at this time, his teachers might think that his sword heart was unstable. Then he really had to wait for another 3 years. The Mirror sect emissary also felt very awkward. He looked at the surrounding guests and felt that his hands, which had just applauded, had no place to put them. He really couldn't understand. This disciple was so talented, he should be the focus of training in the Mirror sect. But in the Aoyama sect, no one wanted him. Finally, a voice came from the cliff. After some discussion, Yunqing Peak decided to accept Shanlin, probably thinking that they couldn't compete with the other peaks for the next few key candidates. Are you willing to learn the old birdsword technique from Elder Chung? Shanlin was overjoyed and said with a trembling voice, "Disciple is willing." After saying this, he hurriedly rode his sword up to a certain spot in the cliff and stood together with his fellow disciples of the Yunqing Peak. The disciples came out one after another to show their cultivation states and sword styles. These inner-sect disciples who had been cultivating by the sword-washing stream for many years had all reached the state of perfect preservation, and 2 or 3 of them had even reached the state of inherited will. They could ride their swords freely and fly among the peaks like birds, and they were even more adept at using the sword. The flying swords rotated and weaved into many light screens, so that even the waterfall couldn't enter within 10 steps of them. Ji Yuanliang, Sikong Yimin, Qi Feng, these names that had appeared many times in the notes of the peaks were also selected after some debate. It was very quiet on the cliff. Having learned his lesson, the mirror sect emissary didn't express his opinion easily. He glanced at the stone platform in the deep end of the clouds once in a while, wondering if the sect master of the Aoyama sect had come in person, or if he was also cultivating that mysterious magic method like his master, Tai Pingzhenren, just like the rumors said. The principal justice of the Guocheng Temple, who came to watch the ceremony, moved the prayer beads in his hands slowly with his eyes closed. The female disciples of Shui Nunnery and those of Qingrong Peak gathered together. They were familiar with each other, and they were talking in a low voice, their laughter sounding like silver bells from time to time. It's really boring. The guests of the Platonist sect sat on the stone platform on the west cliff. A young girl of about 13 or 14 years old stared at the flowing water in the cracks of the stone under her feet, feeling a bit sore in her eyes. She rubbed her eyes and yawned, the little bells on her lovely earlobes making a crisp sound. The 2 little bells had a silvery luster. Was this young girl a silver bell messenger with a high status? What do you know? A young woman rubbed her head affectionately, saying, "The Aoyama sect is a major sword sect. The sword performance looks boring, but it's actually not that simple. The problem is that it's too boring. One sword over, another sword over. There's nothing interesting about it." The young girl of the Platonist sect pouted and said, "I wouldn't have come if I had known it would be so boring." Suddenly, a sound came from the bottom of the cliff. She stood up and took a look. She found the crowd was a bit chaotic, so she couldn't help but feel interested. Looking at the thin youth walking to the middle of the stream, she said, "Senior Master, look, isn't he the one with natural Tao quality you pointed out to me earlier?" Lu Shui came to the middle of the stream. A series of exclamations broke out on both sides of the cliff. There was a commotion in the middle of the cliff, and countless gazes were fixed on him. On the high cliff, the principal justice of the Guocheng Temple opened his eyes, the guests from Ozawa stood up, and the messengers of the mirror sect came to the cliff's edge earlier, looking down. The guests showed great interest in Lu Shui, or in other words, they were curious about him. The cultivation circle knew that Lu Shui was a person with natural Tao quality, and he was the 3rd person with natural Tao quality in the Aoyama sect in the last 10 years. A person with natural Tao quality was a 1 in a million genius in cultivation. It was considered lucky for a regular sect to meet one in 100 years. The luck of the Aoyama sect was really enviable. Zhuo Rizhui and Zhao Leu came from the West Ocean and Zhaoga City respectively. Their family backgrounds were extraordinary, and they had many dealings with the cultivation circle, so they were easy to find. But it was said that this Lu Shui had lived in a remote village since he was a child, and he had never had any contact with cultivation before entering the sect. How did the Aoyama sect find him? Looking at the youth standing on the stream, the feelings of the sects were complicated. Lu Shui wasn't affected at all. He stood on the rock in the stream and wielded his sword in a simple manner. The flying sword broke through the air without any residual shadow or sword light. It seemed that it had arrived at the stone wall 100 feet away in an instant. It was so quiet that not even a ripple could be seen in the flowing water, but a round and thin hole appeared on the stone wall. The seemingly ordinary scene drew a few surprised gasps from the cliff. Lu Shui put 2 fingers on his left hand together, displaying the most common sword formula in the Book of Swordplay. The flying sword flew back from the stone wall. He seemed to casually take a step towards the stream and landed on the sword. Then, he flew up with the sword. The flying sword dragged a residual shadow behind it and suddenly sped up, turning into a clear light. In a few breaths, it had already flown out of the cliff peak, breaking through the clouds with a somewhat ear-piercing whistle. People looked up and saw that he had become a black dot in the sky, which had long surpassed the height of the 9 peaks. After a while, Lu Shui returned on his sword. He didn't blush, and his breathing was calm. He bowed in silence, as if he hadn't done anything. It was quiet among the cliffs, and then cheers suddenly broke out. Good, good, good. Lu Shui's flying sword looked simple, but was actually very steady, without any unnecessary moves. It was the style of swordsmanship pursued by the Aoyama sect. Even though his state was still low, a 14-year-old youth could perform so well, and even had the style of a master. How could people not admire him? Is this the natural Taoist quality? The girl from the Platonist sect murmured. She was already a silver bell messenger at such a young age. Her background was naturally extraordinary, and her talent and vision were not bad either. She knew that Lu Shui's seemingly simple performance was actually not simple. However, for someone like her who loved to watch, she still felt that it wasn't exciting enough. In the next moment, her eyes lit up, and she was refreshed. A calm-looking young disciple walked to the rock in the stream and stood opposite to Lu Shui. Chapter 39. This disciple was Lin Yingliang, a classmate of Lu Shui in Class A. He also learned sword from Lu Shui and was favored by Liangwang Peak. It was unknown whether he challenged Lu Shui at this time because of Liangwang Peak's arrangement or because he was angry that Lu Shui had received too much attention. Senior brother Lin, please. Lu Shui cupped his hands, and the flying sword hovered in front of his hands. This was the salute of the sword. He was a little surprised by Lin Yingliang's challenge, but he soon calmed down, and no panic could be seen on his face. Just like Jing Jiu's evaluation of him, this young man was smart, kind, and had perseverance and persistence that didn't match his age. This kind of young man would rarely be affected by the changes of the outside world. This was the so-called stay true to your heart. Lu Shui and Lin Yingliang stood more than 30 meters apart. The stream flowed between the rocks, making a soft sound. The distance of 30 meters was the most effective attack range of the realm of first preservation. The young girl from the Platonist sect stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the scene below with her eyes wide open, wondering who would win. The answer came soon. The sword fights of the Aoyama sect always started suddenly and ended quickly. 2 white lines appeared on the surface of the stream. 2 sword lights illuminated the cliff, and then suddenly disappeared. Lu Shui's flying sword stopped in front of Lin Yingliang, 3 inches away from the center of his eyebrows. Lin Yingliang's flying sword also stopped in front of Lu Shui, about a foot away. The 2 flying swords seemed to stop at the same time, but in the eyes of the sword masters on the cliff, the difference was obvious. Lu Shui's sword was half a second faster than his opponent's. In daily life, half a second was less than the blink of an eye. The tea would not be cold, and the fragrance would not be short. But in the sword fights, half a second was enough to determine the winner, or even life and death. Moreover, Lu Shui's sword was closer than Lin Yingliang's. That's it. The little girl from the Platonist sect looked at the scene in the stream and said with her eyes wide open. She often watched her senior brothers and sisters spar with each other in the sect. If both parties had similar realms, they would usually fight for a long time. They might even fight from dawn to dusk, and it would be difficult to determine the winner. Who would have thought that the duel between fellow disciples of the Aoyama sect would be so simple and fast? Putting everything else aside, it was really boring. The young woman said, "The Aoyama sect has never been particular about fancy tricks. They only care about the speed and power of their flying swords. The sword techniques of the 9 peaks only use different Dao techniques to make a fuss about these two aspects. When used in battle, they usually kill with one strike. It's extremely dangerous, so not many people dare to provoke them. The little girl said, "Wouldn't it be easy to injure them by accident? Then how do they practice their swordsmanship?" The young woman said, "That's right. That's why the Aoyama sect rarely has duels between fellow disciples. Occasionally, the duels must be conducted under the supervision of the masters. Besides, except during the inherited sword competition and the sword trial competition, the flying swords are strictly forbidden to aim at each other's bodies. They can only aim at the right side of each other's body." The little girl asked confusedly, "How can they improve their swordsmanship without actual combat?" The young woman said with a slightly cold expression, "That's why the Aoyama sect has a place like Liangwang Peak." The little girl said, "Ah, I know about Liangwang Peak. Senior sister said that it's full of a group of cold-hearted weirdos." The young woman smiled and changed the topic, saying, "Don't think the swordsmanship is boring. If you were standing the stream, could you have avoided Lu Shisui's sword?" Thinking of the silent flying sword, the little girl snorted and said, "Even if I couldn't avoid it, I could have set up the formation of Soul Bell in advance. How could his sword have pierced in?" The young woman said, "If you were chatting or drinking wine a few tables away, would you have time to set up the formation if he suddenly attacked?" The little girl thought of the scene described by her martial uncle, and for some reason, she suddenly felt a little cold. She clenched her teeth and said, "Then I'll stay away from him. That guy's flying sword can only attack 100 feet away. I'll set up the Soul Bell at 100 feet, no, 200 feet away. When he comes to attack with his sword, I'll have already borrowed enough spiritual energy to kill him." The young woman smiled and didn't say anything else. In her heart, however, she was thinking, if the disciple of Aoyama sect you're facing has already entered the state of inherited will and can kill people with flying swords, how would you deal with that? What's more, the swordsmen of the Aoyama sect in the Broken Sea state could kill people from dozens of miles away with their flying swords. How could you defend against that? What if he was in the reaching heaven state? Would you have to hide under the ground, or in the shell of the spiritual turtle, or live in the dark formation all day long? Thinking of the miserable lives of the 3 most famous hidden swordsmen in the cultivation world, she looked at the thick fog where the head of the Aoyama sect was, feeling a little scared. Similar conversations between the uncle and nephew of the Platonic sect were taking place in many places. Though the disciples participating in the inherited sword competition were still in a low state, being able to witness the sword work of the Aoyama sect with their own eyes was certainly beneficial to their own disciples' cultivation. The guests of various sects who came to watch the competition would never miss such an opportunity. They kept explaining the seemingly simple battle of flying swords in a low voice. Lu Shui stood on the rock in the stream, remaining silent. Surrounded by countless gazes and cheers, he couldn't help but feel a little strange. He looked to somewhere subconsciously. Jingjiu was sitting on the green rock, looking at him with a smile. Lu Shui seemed to have thought of something, and turned his face away, feeling a little panicked. Though Lin Yingliang had lost the sword fight, his performance was excellent. His flying sword was steady and swift. A master of Shuriwei Peak sent him an invitation, and he chose to accept it. Liangwang Peak remained silent during the whole process, not knowing what it meant. The next step was to find out where Lu Shui would go. It suddenly became quiet in the cliffs, and no one spoke for a long time. The young girl of the Platonic sect felt strange, saying, "Isn't he of natural Tao quality? Why doesn't anyone want him? Though his face is a little dark and ugly, he obviously won." Her senior master said with a smile, "Silly girl, it's not that nobody wants him. It's that too many people want him." Lu Shui would go to Liangwang Peak eventually, but it was also important to know who he would go to Liangwang Peak with. In order to obtain this inherited sword with natural Tao quality, the 9 peaks had communicated with each other in secret many times beforehand, and each had used different methods. Qingrong Peak proposed to recruit Lu Shui to the 9 peaks a year ago. Even though it didn't work out, it was still a gesture of goodwill. Shanghai Peak took an unconventional approach and tried to investigate him directly. They intended to use this method to plan ahead of time. However, Lu Shui had learned the breathing method of Yuman before he entered the sect. It was a method personally taught by the sect master. As expected, a clear and gentle voice came out from the deep end of the quiet clouds and fog. Lu Shui, are you willing to learn sword work from Elder Bai? Was this the voice of the sect master of Aoyama's sect? Many ordinary disciples and guests thought to themselves. The sect master took Zhuoruzhui as his personal disciple and never took any more disciples. Bai Rujing was an elder of the Tianguang Peak branch and had reached the upper state of the Broken Sea. It was a great opportunity to learn sword work from such a powerful swordsman. All the peaks had guessed this a year ago, but they were sure that Lu Shui was a pawn of the sect master when they heard this. The crowd remained silent, perhaps out of disappointment or for other reasons. Lu Shui looked at the cliffs. Guhan nodded slightly. This disciple is willing, said Lu Shui. Having said that, he rode his sword up into the clouds and fog, and a personal disciple of Tianguang Peak welcomed him in. After learning sword work from Senior Master Bai for a year and building a solid foundation, he can go out and gain experience. Guananshan said. Guhan said, Shui won't disappoint you, big brother. As for whether Elder Bai would agree to let Lu Shui go to Liangwang Peak, it was not something they needed to consider. Which young disciple of the Aoyama sect didn't want to come to Liangwang Peak? And no master would stop them, because it was the rule. The number of disciples waiting by the stream was getting smaller and smaller. Yunxing Peak, Shuriyue Peak, Qingrong Peak, and Shilai Peak had all chosen a few disciples they had long ago, and even Shangda Peak had chosen 2 disciples with good potential. Vihu Peak, which had always been popular in the past, was the only one who didn't get chosen. Vihu Peak had been defeated in the competition with other peaks a few times and wasn't chosen. Everybody knew it had something to do with that event. There were 3 disciples whose performances were too ordinary, so they were not selected by any of the peaks. They could only wait for the next inherited sword competition or directly give up and choose a peak to be a deacon. Jingzhu noticed that Lu Shui glanced at Guhan before agreeing to inherit the sword. This scene made him feel interesting. What happened between you and him? Asked Zhao Liu. Jingzhu said, I didn't know you would care about this. Zhao Liu said, people are the same as the principal guards. They all have curiosity. Jingzhu said, I'm also curious about which peak are you going to, Qingrong or Shuriyue? Zhao Liu said, what about you? Why don't you get out? Jingzhu said with a smile, you know I'm going to inherit the sword? Zhao Liu said, a lazy person like you wouldn't waste time. Generally speaking, to say a person was lazy meant that he liked to waste time. She said Jingzhu was lazy, but she thought it was because he didn't want to waste time. This was a very interesting interpretation. I don't like being stared at either, said Zhao Liu. They had talked about this topic last year on the day of the first snow. But as you said, it's impossible for the sun to be blocked by clouds every day. The sun is there, so who wouldn't look at it? She looked at the side of Jingzhu's face and continued, so when it's time to stand out, you have to stand out. Jingzhu said, you're right, but if you don't want to be stared all the time, there is another way. How? Asked Zhao Liu. Become the real sun. Jingzhu said, the light is too bright, so few people dare look at us directly. Having said that, he stood up and walked toward the stream. The disciples by the stream didn't know what he was going to do, and there was a slight commotion. The elder of Shuriyue Peak, who was in charge of the inherited sword competition, asked confusedly, what are you going to do, young man? Jingzhu said confusedly, to inherit the sword. The elder of Shuriyue Peak turned the register to the end and saw his name. There was an uproar by the stream. Shuiyong. He stood up abruptly, pointing at Jingzhu. After a while, he finally refrained from saying that. Sister Yushan covered her mouth with her hands. Chapter 40. The commotion in the stream alerted the masters on the cliffs, and the news spread to the stone platform on the high cliff. A young sister Shui Yununari, who had just returned from Qingrong Peak, looked at the distance curiously and asked, "Who is this guy? He looks so handsome." A young disciple of the Windy Broadsword Church said with furrowed eyebrows, "Judging by the commotion, this guy should be very famous in the Aoyama sect." Looking at the stream, Guhan had a terrible expression on his face. Guan Anshan patted his shoulder, saying nothing with a smile. Ma Hua didn't seem to see the scene, and scolded with a smile. "This guy doesn't even have a sword, so how could he inherit this sword?" Yes, how could he inherit the sword without a sword? Jing Jiao was empty-handed, so how could he have a sword? Half a year ago, Jing Jiao climbed the sword peak and entered the clouds easily. Everyone thought he would succeed in obtaining the sword soon, but no one saw him climb the sword peak again. So he didn't obtain the fairy sword left by Senior Master Mo. Many masters, including Senior Master Mei Li, were angry at his lack of ambition, but they had no choice but to accept the fact that Jing Jiao was not a genius like Lu Shui, and he might have to wait until the next inherited sword competition 3 years from now to realize his true potential and show his own brilliance. Unexpectedly, Jing Jiao stood out at this moment. Did he succeed in obtaining the sword? Then when did he go to obtain it? Where was the sword? Yes, where was the sword? Hearing the discussions around him, Jing Jiao realized he had forgotten something. No wonder he felt he had forgotten something in the past half a year. Yes, he had forgotten the sword. That night half a year ago, he and Zhao Lei joined hands to kill the swordsmen of the undefeated of Bihu Peak in the chaotic clouds on the sword peak. And then he took the sword with him. Where did he put the sword? Jing Jiao began to recall carefully. He carried the corpse in his left hand, the sword in his right hand, and the head in his right hand. He felt it was inconvenient to carry the head, so he inserted the head into the sword. Naturally, the sword was stained with blood. After returning to the cave, it was very conspicuous under the light of the lamp. He felt that it was troublesome to wash the sword, so he threw it to the monkeys on the cliff to clean it. Then he forgot about it and forgot to ask for the sword back from the ape. Yes, that's right. The sword should still be in the hands of those apes. It did not take him long to think of these things, but it did take him some time. The elder of Shuriwa Peak had a terrible look on his face as he asked icily, "Where is the sword?" He looked at Jing Jiao's empty hands and thought to himself, "Unless your sword pill is completed and you have entered the state of undefeated, I'd like to see how you're going to make a sword appear." "Wait a moment," Jing Jiao said. He then looked at the cliff downstream and asked, "Where's the sword?" The forest between the cliffs was extremely dense. Following his voice, the leaves rustled and the apes cried out continuously. The green forest was slightly disturbed, and smoke and dust could be vaguely seen rising. It was unknown how many apes screamed into the distance, but their voices gradually became softer. Not long after, the apes' cries got closer. It must have run back. The forest swayed, and the smoke and dust rose slightly. A dozen apes climbed onto the tree branches. An ape stood at the highest point of the forest, waving his long arms and crying out anxiously. That ape was holding a sword in his hand. The cultivation practitioners were everywhere by the stream and in the cliffs. Their eyesight was much sharper than that of the mortals, so they had seen the scene in the cliffs clearly. Seeing the scene, many people had a terrible look on their faces. Guhan's face was so gloomy that it looked like it was about to drip water. As far as the people of the Aoyama sect were concerned, the flying swords were the most reliable companions and the most steadfast comrades in arms. They loved their flying swords very much. They slept with them every night, cleaned them every day, and nurtured them from time to time. Unexpectedly, Jing Jiao threw the sword to those apes to play with after he successfully retrieved it. This was a disrespect to the deceased Senior Master Mo, to Shuriwa Peak, and to the word sword. The ape threw the sword at him. No matter how intelligent he was still a monkey, and he couldn't control the direction of the sword. The sword tumbled in the air and was about to fall into the stream. Seeing this, some people looked even worse. The elder of Shuriwa Peak sneered and was about to ride his sword to catch the sword, but he stopped soon after. It was because Jingjiu had already raised his hand. The sword suddenly stopped spinning in the air. Whoosh! The sword fell down from the air, turning into a flash of green light and disappearing by the stream. Countless gazes fell on Jingjiu's right hand. He was holding a sword in his hand. The sword had a dim luster, a bit wide and straight. It was the magic sword that Master Mo of Shuriwa Peak had returned to the Aoyama sect last year. Everyone was shocked. That sword was still 100 feet away from the stream in the air. Jingjiu reached out his hand, and the sword fell into his hand. What he did was to retrieve the sword, not to draw it out. But he could call it back from such a long distance, which meant he had reached the state of perfect preservation. So he was qualified to participate in the inherited sword competition. Shui Yong, he said excitedly to the people around him. I knew I was right. He must have been practicing diligently every night in the cave. He is too good at pretending. People were surprised, but they were dissatisfied after they came back to their senses. Some people were dissatisfied because they felt they might miss something, like Senior Master Mei Li of Qingrong Peak. Why didn't she know that Jingjiu had successfully retrieved the sword? Looking at Lin Wuji, who was smiling silently in the distance, she knew he had guessed it in advance. Her face grew unsightly, as she knew he was one step ahead of her. Some people were dissatisfied because of Jingjiu's attitude. It's a bit disrespectful for you to treat the sword left behind by your seniors so casually. Ma Hua's fat face was devoid of a smile, which was rare. He looked very serious. Jingjiu glanced at him. Normally, he wouldn't pay attention to this fat man, but today was the inherited sword competition, so he thought he should be more polite. This is my sword. He had no other explanation than this statement. This was the sword he retrieved from the sword peak. So was his sword. Everything in the past should be erased with this sword. There was no such thing as the sword left behind by the seniors. He could do whatever he wanted to do. Hearing this answer, Guhan and Ma Hua recalled the conversation that had taken place in the same place. At that time, Guhan asked sarcastically if Jingjiu was qualified to use Senior Master Mo's sword. Jingjiu's answer was very simple, one word: yes. He was good at ending a boring conversation with a word or a sentence. Because when he said that word or that sentence, he never hesitated, never thought. There was a sense of it as if it was only right and proper. It's really annoying, Ma Hua said sentimentally. Guhan's expression grew colder and colder. Now that you have the sword, you can draw it out, Guan Nanshan said. His expression was still mild, with a smile on his face. Ma Hua felt a chill in his eyes. He understood what Guan Nanshan meant. So he whispered something to someone beside him. Guhan suddenly said, "Let Gu Qing do it." Ma Hua was a bit surprised, thinking that Guan Nanshan thought too highly of that guy. Jingjiu's way of drawing the sword was indeed beautiful, but he was just a sword-washing disciple after all. Why would he be so valued? Guan Nanshan said after a moment of silence, "That's fine. Since Jingjiu was more arrogant than he had imagined, he should suffer more setbacks, so that he could mature as soon as possible." He thought he did. The gentle breeze stirred the surface of the stream. A young disciple walked into the stream from the other side. The gentle breeze lifted his sword robe, making him look like an immortal. "Oh, this new guy is quite good-looking," the girl from the Platonist sect said, although not as good as the one on the other side. The one on the other side was, of course, Jingjiu. Jingjiu looked at the young man, feeling a bit surprised. The disciples by the stream were also discussing, because many of them had never seen this young man before. Some who knew the inside story explained to them, and then they knew that this young man was the legendary Gu Qing. Chapter 41. Gu Qing was Gu Han's younger brother, and also Guan Nanshan's sword boy. He was not born with Taoist quality, but he was very talented. Because of Gu Han, he was sent to Lianwang Peak as soon as he was born, and he had been learning sword from Guan Nanshan all these years. Among the new generation of sword-washing disciples, his realm was second to none. In the eyes of those who knew Lianwang Peak well, he might even be stronger than Zhao Liu. However, He had been staying at Liangwang Peak all these years and rarely appeared by the stream of sword washing, so not many people knew of his existence. Gu Qing walked to the stream rock and stopped. The discussion among the cliffs and the stream didn't stop, but became louder and louder. Gu Qing didn't take another step forward. The position was the most important thing. The stream rock he was standing on was dozens of feet away from Jingjiao. What did it mean? Such a long distance was beyond the attacking range of the state of first preservation. Did Gu Qing enter the state of inherited will when he was at the stage of sword washing? Not only did he get a glimpse of Tao, but he also possessed the attacking ability of the state of inherited will? People were shocked. They didn't know that Liangwang Peak was hiding such a talented young man. The expression on Guan Nanshan's face was quite calm. Gu Qing had been his sword boy for many years. In fact, they were half master and half disciple. So Guan Nanshan knew Gu Qing's realm and strength very well. Guan Nanshan had planned to use Gu Qing to break Zhao Lei's spirit, but he didn't expect Jingjiao to stand up in advance. Gu Han made this request again. He knew Gu Han's mood, so he didn't stop him. As for the result of this sword competition, of course there would be no surprise. Gu Han stared at Jingjiao below with a sneer on the corners of his mouth. He didn't like Jingjiao when he saw him for the first time at the foot of Sword Peak because of Lu Shui and some other reasons that were hard to explain. Ma Hua said with a smile, "An uncut jade is worthless. I hope junior brother Jing can understand our painstaking efforts when he comes to Tao." In the inherited sword competition, the disciples could show off their best sword-riding skills, but when someone challenged them, it was better not to refuse. Aoyama sect cultivates the way of the sword, and they despise people who avoid battles. Therefore, when Lin Yingliang challenged Lu Shui, none of the teachers felt that there was anything wrong with it. Lu Shui also accepted it very naturally. But everybody knew that Jingjiao was different from the regular disciples. For someone as lazy as Jingjiao, who knew what kind of reaction he would give, including Shui Yong Yi, junior sister Yushan, and other old disciples of the South Pine Pavilion, many disciples were wondering if he would say, "I won't fight with you." Other than Jingjiao's temperament, the other reason why the disciples thought this way was because they could not see any hope of Jingjiao winning. Even if Jingjiao had reached the consummation of the realm of perfect preservation, how could he be a match for a genius disciple who had entered the inherited will state in advance? Separated by a distance of several dozen zhang, your sword couldn't even touch your opponent's body, so how could you talk about defeating him? Since he was bound to lose, surrendering naturally became a possible option, even though it was a little embarrassing. "Please." Gu Qing cupped his hands, and the flying sword flew out of his sleeves. He stood still in front of his body and performed a sword salute. Jingjiao said, "Okay." He didn't directly surrender. There was a slight commotion by the stream between the cliffs. Some people felt it was a pity, some were satisfied, and some sighed. More people felt that what was going to happen next would be very embarrassing. Junior sister Yushan covered her face, and young Yuan from Lelong Commandery comforted her in a low voice. "Is this the so-called training, or do you just want to humiliate him?" Zhao Leiyu raised her head and looked at the cliffs. The disciples of Liangwang Peak were standing there. Of course, she remembered the fight with Master Zhua of Bihu Peak in the clouds of Sword Peak that night. The gap between the realms couldn't be made up by talent and means. Even if Jingjiao had a magic treasure to protect himself like her, how could he use it in public? Moreover, if Jingjiao hadn't helped her that day, she would still have been killed by Master Zhua's sword. As she was thinking about this, Gu Qing drew his sword. Just like the disciples who had appeared before him, his attack was very simple. As his robe sleeves fluttered, the sword light appeared and then suddenly disappeared. A gray line appeared on the surface of the stream. The ancient flying sword flew over a distance of hundreds of feet in an instant. Its speed and power didn't decrease at all, and it went straight to Jingjiao's face. Zhao Leiyu's black pupils shrank slightly. Gu Qing had not only entered the state of inherited will, but was also close to the consummation, which was similar to her real state. When Gu Qing's flying sword arrived in front of Jingjiao, he still didn't move, as if he was scared out of his wits. Of course, this wasn't the real reason. People knew it was because Gu Qing's sword was too fast, so fast that ordinary disciples couldn't react at all. Next, the flying sword would stop in front of Jingjiao, only a few inches away from the center of his eyebrows. Gu Qing said calmly, "Thank you for letting me win." Then the winner was decided. Everyone thought they would see this scene. However, it didn't happen. A voice resounded from the surface of the stream and spread in all directions. The sound was very clear, very crisp. The wind blew across the stream. The gray line suddenly stopped. The flying sword fell diagonally and landed in the stream, causing a splash. It was deathly quiet. Countless shocked gazes fell on Jingjiao. What had happened? Jingjiao stood on the rock, as if he hadn't moved at all. He held his sword casually, like a hunter holding a stick, looking for pheasants in the forest. When Gu Qing's sword flew in front of him, he really swung it and smashed it down. The flying sword was accurately hit by his sword, like a pheasant hit by a stick. It fell into the stream without a sound. It was very quiet, and the sound of the stream was very clear. Gu Qing even thought he could hear the sound of his blood flowing quickly. At first, he wasn't sure what had happened to him, until he saw the very familiar sword in the stream. His face was a bit hot, but it grew paler and paler, and a wildfire started burning deep in his eyes. He suddenly raised his head to look at Jingjiao, his eyes full of shock and anger, and shouted, "Ah!" Following this shout, the flying sword that had fallen into the stream flew up again. This time, the flying sword was obviously faster, and its power was even more amazing. More shockingly, the water in the stream turned into steam before it could drip off the sword. It was not hard to imagine how hot the sword was at the moment. When the flying sword came to the middle of the stream, it started burning. A line of fire illuminated the cliff wall, pointing directly at Jingjiao with an amazing momentum. The six-dragon sword. How could he know this sword style? Many surprised screams broke out among the cliffs. The high standard of the six-dragon returning to sun. What Gu Qing used was obviously the sword style of Shuriwa Peak. People were shocked. The elder of Shuriwa Peak, who presided over the inherited sword competition, had a terrible look on his face. The disciples of Liangwang Peak could learn any sword style of the 9 peaks. Gu Qing grew up on Liangwang Peak, so it was not surprising that he could learn the six-dragon sword. The problem was that Gu Qing was only a sword-washing disciple, and Liangwang Peak taught him the sword style of the 9 peaks in advance, which was something that couldn't be revealed to the public. It was too unfair for those ordinary disciples who had no background. Seeing Gu Qing use the six-dragon sword of Shuriwa Peak, many people in the cliffs were dissatisfied. Yet, they understood why Gu Qing exposed his true prowess at the risk of being punished later on. It was because Gu Qing was very angry at the moment and wanted to defeat Jingjiao in the simplest and most brutal way. In the previous fight, he had lost in a very embarrassing manner. Though he had underestimated his opponent, he couldn't accept that his precious flying sword was shot down by a colleague in a lower state in such a crude and unaesthetic way. The burning flying sword flew toward Jingjiao like a horrible fiery dragon. Seeing this, Zhao Liu thought that if she didn't want to dodge the attack, she would have to rely on her sword heart to kill Jingjiao. She knew clearly that Jingjiao didn't hide his cultivation state, so he couldn't counterattack like she did. But she wasn't worried. She trusted this youth in white very much, and felt that he would have a way to deal with it. She didn't know if it was because of the encounter that night or some other reason. Chapter 42. His current cultivation state was still too low. If he couldn't see it clearly, he would be in trouble. Staring at the line of fire, Jingjiao swung his sword down. A muffled bang resounded. His sword hit the front of the line of fire accurately again. Sparks flew everywhere, and Gu Qing's sword was knocked away, falling into the stream at an angle. It was no different from the previous scene. Along with a sizzling sound, the stream water around the sword turned into white mist. Jingjiao took a look at the sword in his hand, thinking it was not bad. It was indeed wide and thick, and very sturdy and easy to use. However, Jingjiao didn't intend to give his opponent too many chances to wield his sword. He stepped on the rocks in the stream and walked toward Gu Qing. The spectators were shocked, speechless. If Gu Qing underestimated his opponent the first time and didn't use his full strength, what about this time? This time, Gu Qing didn't use the regular sword style in the classic of sword, but the real sword style of Shuriwa Peak. Why did he still end up like this with the power of thunder and fire? How could this be possible? Seeing Jing Jiao approaching, Gu Qing murmured with a pale face. By the stream, Shui Yongmi thought it wasn't him who said it. The sword fight had to continue since the winner hadn't been decided yet. Gu Qing calmed himself down with great willpower and summoned his flying sword back with the help of the sword formula, slashing at Jing Jiao again. Just like before, his flying sword was heavily struck down with a clear ring, falling into the stream once more. With a shout, Gu Qing used all the sword source in his body to summon his flying sword, launching the craziest attack. Jing Jiao arched his eyebrows. Seeing this, Zhao Lei knew Jing Jiao was getting impatient. Jing Jiao's left hand landed on the hilt of the sword, assuming the posture of holding the sword with both hands. It was a loud bang. It was like the famous broken bell behind the mountain of Guocheng Temple was struck again. Gu Qing's sword flew high in the sky and lost control, rolling around and making a whining sound, as if someone was crying. In the end, the sword drew an arc in the air and turned into a black duck, landing in the forest a few thousand feet away. Countless shocked gazes followed him. The dark shadows in the forest moved about, and the dust rose again. The excited cries of the monkeys could be heard. Jing Jiao walked up to Gu Qing. The distance between them was no longer hundreds of feet, but less than 3 feet. Jing Jiao was holding a sword. Gu Qing's sword was on the horizon. The situation was a little awkward. Was the outcome already decided? Jing Jiao didn't say, "Thank you for letting me win." Of course, Gu Qing couldn't say the word "admit defeat" out loud. "Turn around," Jing Jiao said to him. Gu Qing's mind was in a mess, and he subconsciously followed his instructions and turned around. Pa pa pa. Jing Jiao raised his sword and hit him 3 times on the back before pulling it back. While doing this, he did not look toward a certain spot in the cliff. Enough! Gu Han's angry rebuke came from the cliff. Are you trying to humiliate Liangwang Peak? Jing Jiao had already turned around and was about to leave. Hearing this rebuke, he looked up at the cliff. He looked at Gu Han, and then exchanged a glance with Guanan Shan. Then he turned around and hit Gu Qing's back again with his sword. "Thank you for letting me win." Those who knew about the entanglement had already guessed that Jing Jiao did it for Liangwang Peak when he hit Gu Qing at the beginning, but he didn't say it. This time, Gu Han had spoken, and he deliberately turned around and hit Gu Qing again, which made the whole thing clear. "Yes, I did it for you." "So what?" Gu Han's face turned livid. Ma Hua squinted and felt disgusted. Only Guanan Shan remained calm, and no one knew what he was thinking. "How did you do it?" Hearing the voice, Jing Jiao looked over and found it was Gu Qing. There was no resentment in Gu Qing's eyes, only frustration and confusion. He couldn't understand why he was defeated in the end when he had reached the state of inherited will and Jing Jiao had only reached the state of perfect preservation. No matter how talented and hardworking Gu Qing was, he was still a teenager. If he didn't get rid of this emotion soon, his heart of sword might be damaged. Jing Jiao thought about how to explain. "Your sword is not fast enough, so I can see it clearly." He continued, "But my sword is faster." Gu Qing was still confused. Swordsmanship only needs 2 extremes, speed and strength, and the rest is not important. "Oh, there's also a sword. It should be a good sword." Jing Jiao said, "Your sword is good, better than mine. So I didn't cut you, but hit you with the body of the sword." Thinking of the previous sword fight, Gu Qing found it was true. Both the word hit and swing were used to describe Jing Jiao's technique. It seemed rude and even inelegant, but it was actually the most delicate control of the sword. Anything else? Nothing. That's it. Gu Qing's bewilderment hadn't completely disappeared. The sword has always been the simplest thing. It's not anything else, it's just a sword. Jingjiu looked at him and said, "It is a sword when it flies in the sky, and it is also a sword when it is held in the hand. Do you understand?" Gu Qing thought for a while, saluted seriously, and returned to the stream bank. Jingjiu looked at the cliff, stretched out his right index finger, and shook it. He was telling the monkeys to stop fooling around and return the sword to the teenager. But in many people's eyes, he was shaking his finger at the people of Liangwang Peak. Many disciples knew that Big Brother Guhan of Liangwang Peak had always disliked Jingjiu and tried to humiliate him, but was stopped by Senior Master Mei Li and Immortal Master Lin Wuji. In their eyes, Jingjiu's actions today were a demonstration to Liangwang Peak and a slap in Guhan's face. In the clouds, Lin Wuji glanced at Lu Shui standing beside him and said with a smile, "Is he helping you vent your anger?" He knew Jingjiu's temperament, and he hated trouble the most. Since the sword fight was won, why did Jingjiu take the unnecessary action of hitting Gu Qing's back 3 times? It was not a humiliation, but a reward. 1 year ago, when Jingjiu had just entered the inner sect, he reunited with Lu Shui at the foot of the Sword Peak. Lu Shui was overjoyed and ran to see him. Guhan was not happy and hit Lu Shui several times according to the rules of Liangwang Peak. Later, Lu Shui secretly went to see Jingjiu and was hit twice more. It had been a long time since those things happened. Jingjiu didn't say anything. It turned out that he hadn't forgotten. Looking at the figure by the stream, Lu Shui was expressionless, looking very serious. Suddenly, he burst into laughter. Then, he quickly calmed himself down and continued to pretend to be indifferent. Looking at Jingjiu standing on a rock by the stream, people were shocked and speechless. Guests from various sects who came to watch the ceremony all came to the edge of the cliff, looking at the scene below, discussing something in low voices. Both the young girl of Shui Yu Nunnery and the serious messenger of Windy Broadsword sect were shocked by the sword fight just now. Jingjiu's state was not high, but how could he defeat Gu Qing? What sword art did he use? Chapter 43. No one heard the conversation between Jingjiu and Gu Qing, so most people didn't understand what had happened. All they knew was that Jingjiu was formidable enough to defeat his opponent in a higher state. The masters of the 9 Peaks have been immersed in the sword work for many years, so they sensed something unusual from this sword fight. Before entering the state of the undefeated, Jingjiu had to rely on his naked eyes to capture the traces of the flying sword. His eyesight was so amazing that it could even be called the sword eyes. Moreover, his sword source was abundant, so he could wield his sword at an unimaginable speed, so that he could accurately hit Gu Qing's flying sword. Being able to hit his opponent's sword didn't mean that he could knock down his opponent's sword. The masters of the 9 Peaks saw it clearly. Every time Jingjiu dropped his sword, he would turn his wrist slightly and use the thickest part of his sword to touch the weakest part of Gu Qing's flying sword. But how could he know where the weakest part of Gu Qing's flying sword was? There was no explanation for this. It could only be said that Jingjiu was born with a keen sense of the sword. This kind of sword technique was very complicated, but it was very easy for Jingjiu to use it. It was because he wielded the sword so smoothly that it felt natural, which made the people of Yunxing Peak, who were known for their exquisite sword work, admire him. But the most impressive fact was another fact. A year ago, when Jingjiu said that he would use the sword left by Senior Master Mo of Shuriwa Peak, some people thought he was using a trick, and some thought he was being kind. It wasn't until now that people realized that he had his eyes on the broadness and sturdiness of the sword, which could bring out his abundant sword source and his godly sword eyes. His sword heart was so calm, his sword sense so keen, and his natural understanding of the sword. What did this mean? It meant that Jingjiu had an amazing talent in the sword work. If Zhou Ruzhui, Zhao Leiyu, and Lu Shui were the people with natural Dao quality most suitable for cultivation, then Jingjiu was the one who was born to use the sword. The Aoyama sect was the #1 sword sect in the world. How could they miss such a disciple? An old man walked out of the clouds that had been quiet for a long time. The old man had an ugly appearance and extremely dark skin. He was none other than Elder Mo of Tianguang Peak. Elder Mo walked to the edge of the cliff and looked at Jingjiu by the stream. He rubbed his hands nervously and said, "Jingjiu, are you willing to learn the sword from me?" The cliff was originally very quiet, but with this sentence there was an uproar. "Jingjiu, are you willing to inherit my sword at Bihu Peak?" As the peak master of Shilai Peak, I promise you that as long as you're willing to come to our peak, we'll do our best. The old bird sword art of Yunqing Peak is the most suitable for this young man. What are you fighting for? Listening to these quarrels, Qi Yin, who had suffered some minor injuries last night, became even paler. He sighed and helplessly thought about how Shanghai Peak would not be able to compete with others if they did not prepare in advance. Elder Mo had only said a single sentence before he was interrupted. He was so angry that his face was flushed red, but it was hard to tell. "Shut up, all of you." Elder Mo had always been good-tempered, but a good-tempered person would occasionally get angry, which was even more frightening. The clear water flowing on the cliff was dispersed by the sword wills, turning into a rainstorm. The quarrels among the cliffs gradually subsided. Didn't you all think this little guy was a good-for-nothing? Why have you all changed now? Elder Mo looked at the people of the peaks and said shamelessly, "How dare you compete with me?" His words were very direct. The people of Bihu Peak, Yunqing Peak, and Shilai Peak could not respond and could only remain silent. Elder Mo looked at Jingjiu and put on the warmest smile on his ugly face, saying, "You know, I'm different from these guys. I've always thought highly of you. Even if you haven't been to the Sword Peak once in the past 6 months, I firmly believe that you'll appear in front of me today." At this moment, Mei Li walked to the edge of the cliff and said with a sneer, "I'm not embarrassed. Well, I took a fancy to this child. You didn't even know who he was, Big Brother Mo." Hearing this, Elder Mo was speechless. Mei Li glanced at Lin Wuji in the distance and said, "I've already said that Jingjiu can only belong to our Qingrong Peak. If any one of you wants to compete with me, don't blame me for being rude." It was then that a deep and warm voice broke out. "Young Sister Mei, you're wrong. If the one who thought highly of him first was qualified to take him into their peak, then our Shuriwe Peak would be ranked first." The speaker was the peak master of Shuriwe Peak, Guang Yuanjinren. Mei Li bowed to him with a slightly solemn expression, but she didn't back down. "I don't know when the immortal paid attention to Jingjiu," she said. Guang Yuanjinren said sentimentally, "It happened 2 years ago. I heard that the outer sect of the South Pine Pavilion had an extraordinarily intelligent and knowledgeable disciple. So I sent a message to young Master Lu, asking if that disciple was willing to come to Shuriwe Peak. Jingjiu, do you still remember this?" Jingjiu nodded. Mei Li didn't know this until now, and said helplessly, "Immortal, you wanted him to be a caretaker at the foot of your peak, not because you saw his talent in sword work. This was the most exciting moment of the inherited sword competition. All the peaks wanted Jingjiu to inherit their swords. Each peak had its own reasons, and each peak had its own reasons. Neither side would back down. Even Lu Shisui didn't fight so fiercely, because all the peaks knew in advance that he was a pawn of the sect master. Jingjiu didn't have any background, so the peaks wouldn't let him go. The disciples by the stream were surprised to see the masters arguing, and even the peak master of Shuriwe Peak came out in person. The dozen disciples who had entered the South Pine Pavilion in recent years were excited, feeling honored. Looking at Jingjiu standing on the green rock, young Sister Yushan was so excited that her face turned slightly red, and she punched young Yuan of Lelong County a few times with her small fists. Young Yuan felt the pain, but didn't dare make a sound, looking very innocent. The argument couldn't go on like this, and the choice was in Jingjiu's hands. "Jingjiu, which peak will you choose?" The elder of Shuriwe Peak, who was in charge of the inherited sword competition, asked him solemnly. Then he lowered his head slightly and said in a voice as low as a mosquito, so low that only he and Jingjio could hear. To be honest, our Shuriwa Peak doesn't have much, but we have an inexhaustible supply of magic pills and spiritual fruits. The Peak Master has some good stuff that even the Sect Master can't get. They can all be yours. Jingjio smiled. Back when he was calculating in the village, his arrangement was to go to Bihu Peak, but now that Lei Poyan was dead, it was meaningless for him to go to Bihu Peak. Mei Li took good care of him, and expressed her desire to let him inherit her sword a long time ago. But for some reason, he would rather die than go to Qingrong Peak. The cultivation on Shilai Peak was to deal with people, but he didn't like dealing with people. The cultivation on Yunxing Peak was to deal with the sword, so it was unnecessary for him. The cultivation on Shuriwa Peak was relatively less stressful, and the days were quite leisurely. However, the disciples of the peaks had to take care of those precious herbs and orchards in addition to organizing the books, which was quite troublesome. Most importantly, there were many monkeys on Shuriwa Peak who were noisy from morning to night, which really displeased him. It seemed that Tianguang Peak was the best choice. Lin Wuji was a good person, and though Mo Chi still stuttered like before, his temperament was as honest and sincere as before. If he inherited the sword from Tianguang Peak, he and Lu Shui would become disciples of the same peak again. Jingjio thought it would be interesting to think about the expression on that small black face. As he was about to make the decision, he suddenly saw the young girl on the green rock, and a new idea occurred to him. I need to think about it, Jingjio said to the elder of Shuriwa Peak. The elder of Shuriwa Peak was a bit disappointed, but he said according to the rules, okay, but you have to make a decision before the end of the inherited sword competition. He was disappointed that Jingjio didn't decide to join Shuriwa Peak immediately. Mei Li of Qingrong Peak and Elder Mo of Tianguang Peak also had the same idea. Some people were disappointed because they thought Jingjio was too arrogant. The elders all looked up to him, but he was still being picky. Did he think he was really something? Jingjio walked back to the green rock. Zhao Leu looked at him and said, "You are really something." "Just so," said Jingjio. Zhao Leu said, "Your talent in sword work can be ranked in the top 3 among those I have ever seen." Jingjio said seriously, "I think my talent in sword work is the best in Aoyama." Zhao Leu didn't know what to say, so she walked past him and headed toward the stream. Countless gazes were fixed on her. In the minds of the crowd, the shock brought by Jingjio was temporarily suppressed. Which peak would Zhao Leu inherit the sword? Which peak had placed her as a chess piece in advance? This was a question that had troubled the Aoyama sect and more than half of the cultivation world for many years, and it would finally be answered today. Chapter 44. The sword light came out of the sleeve and stopped in front of Zhao Leu in silence. It was the small green sword. This Qin Jian was very old, but it didn't have anything special about it. When Zhao Leu had entered the inner gate for 3 months, she had been recognized by the Qin Jian on the sword peak, which shocked many people, but also made them feel sorry for her. This Qin Jian was made of an ordinary material. In their minds, if Zhao Leu had been more patient, she could have gotten a better sword. She was about to draw her sword, but was stopped. The elder of Shuriwa Peak who presided over the competition said to her kindly, "You don't have to watch." If it were some other outstanding disciples, they would insist that they should be treated the same as other disciples, so that the fairness of the sect could be demonstrated. However, Zhao Leu didn't say anything, and put the sword back in her sleeve, either because she was influenced by Jingjio, or because she thought it was boring and troublesome to perform the sword work. Of course, nobody challenged her. The only one qualified to challenge her, Gu Qing, had been defeated by Jingjio. What followed was the most attractive part of the inherited sword competition, choosing and being chosen. Different from the fierce competition for Jingjio, it was quiet among the cliffs, which made the competition even more tense. It seems that everybody knows the procedure. The elder of Shuriwa Peak said to the crowd in the cliffs solemnly, "Let's do it in order." Hearing the meaning of this sentence, Everyone was very clear about what would happen next. It seemed that such a thing had happened before in the history of the inherited sword competition of the Aoyama sect. When all the peaks wanted a disciple, problems would arise if the competition was too fierce. Therefore, the procedure had to be decided in advance. The 9 peaks would communicate with the disciple in order. The order here was actually reversed, starting from the last mountain peak in the ranking. The first peak was Bihu Peak. The senior master of the upper state of free travel, who had just become the peak master of Bihu the night before, said a few words. Then the master of Shilai Peak came out and said a few words. It was obvious that they had no confidence in getting Zhao Leu. They simply introduced the characteristics of their peak and tried to persuade her. The peak master Shuriwei was going to take Jingjiu as his personal disciple, so another elder stepped forward. The gentle voice of the peak master of Qingrong echoed in the cliffs for a long time. Now, people realized that this woman with the highest cultivation state and seniority in Aoyama sect was determined to win Zhao Leu's heart. Yunxing Feng considered that Zhao Leu had been practicing hard on the sword peak for the past 2 years, so they should have a good chance. Therefore, he spent a long time explaining. Next was Shanghai Peak. The Shanghai Peak of this year's inherited sword competition was still the same as the previous years. It was not favored by the disciples, and many people thought that there was no chance for it. No one expected a cold and dignified voice to ring out. "You are the future of my Aoyama. Meeting a mediocre teacher will only hinder your cultivation. Let me do it." The master of Shanghai Peak, Yuan Qijing, who hadn't taken a disciple for many years and seldom participated in the inherited sword competition, came and decided to teach the sword in person. Though Shanghai Peak was not popular, who was Yuan Qijing? He was the sword justice of Aoyama, among the 9 peaks, who had more experience, higher power, higher cultivation state, and was more qualified to take Zhao Leu as his personal disciple. The crowd was in an uproar, and then became quiet soon after. It was then that an unexpected change occurred. "Little Leu, are you willing to learn sword work with me?" The voice was gentle and distant, like the moist wind on the coastline, falling on everyone's heart. People were very surprised, because it was the voice of the sect master. No wonder the elder Bai of Tianguang Peak came to take Lu Shui as an inherited sword disciple. It turned out that the sect master intended to reserve his spot for Zhao Leu. Was Zhao Leu the one chosen by the sect master from the very beginning? Was the mystery going to be solved at last? The problem was that the sect master had taken Zhuo Ruzhui as his personal disciple a few years ago. Was he going to make an exception? Zhuo Ruzhui, Lu Shui, and Zhao Leu, if the 3 of them with natural Dao quality all went to Tianguang Peak, the atmosphere in the cliffs became tense. Both Qingrong Peak and Yunxing Peak, which usually followed the lead of Tianguang Peak, had a strong objection to this decision. Even Bihu Peak, Shuriwei Peak, and Shilai Peak, who didn't have much opinion, felt uncomfortable. Why? But who dared compete with the sect master for the disciple? Let her choose for herself. Yuan Qijing's voice was extremely cold. Only he could stop the sect master from talking. It was because he used to be the sect master's big brother of the same peak. That's right. The peak master of Qingrong said, "Leu, calm down. Don't be distracted by something. You can choose whatever you want. Don't be afraid." Zhao Leu didn't say anything the whole time. Her expression didn't change at all, whether it was the sudden request from Shanghai to Peak or the personal invitation from the sect master. It wasn't until now that she heard what the peak master of Qingrong said that she raised her thick eyebrows like a sword, and her eyes became extremely bright. From Zhaoga City to Aoyama, from the South Pine Pavilion to the Inner Gate, many people wanted to know which peak she would choose at the inherited sword competition. She had never expressed her opinion, not even the slightest hint of her attitude, because she was waiting for this opportunity. "I can choose whatever I want." She repeated what the peak master of Qingrong had said. Yuan Qijing said coldly, "That's right. Nobody can stop you." Zhao Leu gazed over the high cliffs at a spot in the distant clouds on the 9 peaks. Some people, including the peak master of Qingrong, suddenly felt something was going to happen, but it was too late to stop it. Shema Peak. Zhao Liu said softly. What? What is she talking about? Zhao Liu smiled faintly, showing two shallow dimples on her cheeks. I said, I want to inherit the sword of Shema Peak. It was quiet in the cliffs. People were shocked, and many thought they had heard it wrong. Countless gazes fell on Zhao Liu. Unexpectedly, she refused the sect master and Yuan Qijing and chose Shema Peak. Shema Peak was the 9th peak in Aoyama. But why did she choose this peak? The voice of the peak master of Qingrong rang out again. Her voice was no longer as clear and gentle as it usually was. Instead, it was cold and serious. Do you know that Shema Peak hasn't participated in the inherited sword competition for hundreds of years? Zhao Liu said calmly. I know, because Senior Grandmaster Jingyang has never taken on a disciple. For hundreds of years, the 9th peak in Aoyama had only had one disciple, Jingyang. Jingyang pursued the Tao wholeheartedly, so he didn't consider the inheritance. The Aoyama sect was used to the fact that the inherited sword competition had nothing to do with Shinma Peak. Since you know, why did you choose the 9th peak? The voice of the peak master of Qingrong was sharp. The 9th peak will have a new inheritance in a few years, but it's something for your young brothers and sisters to consider. Before Jingyang ascended, even if he didn't take on a disciple, nobody dared to say anything. Now, how could the Aoyama sect let Shema Peak be empty? The rules of Aoyama sect stated clearly that if no one inherited the sword after 3 inherited sword competitions, the inheritance of that peak would be regarded as broken and a new branch would be created. The question was, would the Shinma Peak after the new branch would still be the Shinma Peak she wanted to go to? Zhao Liu looked at the cliffs in silence for a long time. Many scenes in the past 10 years seemed to appear on the stone walls and flowing water. She had been very intelligent since she was a child, and she had read 3,000 books at a young age. Then, she began to prepare for cultivation. Cultivation was a very hard thing, monotonous and boring, often accompanied by both mental and physical pain. In Zhaoga City, she was a noble girl, but she could endure more hardships than the snow monsters in the kingdom of ice and snow. After coming to Aoyama, she was even more diligent than before. In the words of Master Ming, she was so diligent that she didn't look like a genius. She had been sitting on the sword peak for 3 years of the tender age, with dirty hair and a dirty face, covered with dust. Why? It was to obtain the qualification to inherit the sword, and to be able to choose freely. Why? Because I don't want to see a new peak. She said, I want to continue the inheritance for Shinma. After a moment of silence, the peak master of Qingrong asked, Why do you want to do this? Zhao Liu said, Because I am the inherited sword disciple chosen by Senior Grandmaster Jingyang. Sitting on a green rock, Jing Jiu looked at the stream, thinking that this was the reason. Chapter 45. The answer that so many people wanted to know was revealed. This answer didn't seem very surprising, but if one thought about it carefully, there were countless meanings hidden within. The cliff fell into a long period of silence. People were speechless because of the shock. In the end, it was the peak master of Qingrong who broke the silence, asking in a chilly voice, He has ascended. Who will you learn the sword from? The thoughtless sword has gone with him. What sword will you inherit? Some guests who came to watch the ceremony noticed that the peak master of Qingrong didn't use the honorific title when she mentioned the immortal Jing Yang, and didn't call him senior master, but called him directly. For some reason, neither the sect master of the Green Mountain sect nor Yuan Qijing said anything. It seemed that this was a normal thing for them. Zhao Liu said, According to the old rule of Aoyama, as long as I can climb to Shinma Peak and obtain the thoughtless sword, I will inherit the sword successfully. As long as she inherited the sword successfully, the inheritance of the 9th peak of Aoyama would be continuous. As for how to learn the sword, she didn't care. The cold voice of Yuan Qijing sounded in the cliff. The Shinma Peak is self-imposed, and the great formation of Aoyama can only open a new path for the sword. If you want to continue the path of the sword on Shinma Peak, the great formation of Aoyama can't help you. The path to the peak is extremely dangerous. Even your senior masters in the state of free travel will have a slim chance of surviving, let alone a regular disciple like you in the state of inherited will. Why do you insist? Zhao Leu said, since I will inherit the sword of senior grandmaster, why would I be afraid of death? The name of the sword on Shinma Peak was Thoughtless, and the sword style used was the 9-death sword. This was the meaning of not regretting even 9 deaths. After a moment of silence, Yuan Shijing said, Good, good, good. He said these 3 words emotionlessly. It was unclear whether he was praising Zhao Leu's courage or he had nothing to say. So, you are the disciple chosen by the young senior master. You have such courage at such a young age. You are indeed the one chosen by the young senior master. I will allow you. The voice of the sect master of Aoyama was full of sentimentality and reminiscence, and also a bit gratified. Yuan Qijing's voice was still cold. If you fail, but luckily survive, you cannot inherit the sword within 3 years, and can only cultivate by the stream. Do you understand? This punishment seemed normal, but it was actually quite severe. Even though Zhao Leu was born with natural Tao quality, it would be very difficult for her to practice the sword if she couldn't get in touch with the truly mysterious sword instructions within 3 years, and without the guidance of a master, she would progress much slower than those of her colleagues who had inherited the sword successfully. As for the matter of cultivation, if one step was slow, all the steps would be slow. Who would be willing to bear the consequences? Many of the guests couldn't bear to see her like this, not to mention the disciples of the Green Mountain sect. Many of them wanted to plead for her. However, as the head of the sword justice of the Green Mountain sect, what Yuan Shijing said was the most authoritative explanation of the sect rules, and even the sect master couldn't deny it easily. Guan Nanshan walked to the edge of the cliff and bowed to the masters above, asking, Can young sister Zhao join Liangwang Peak? Of? By. The of the peak of the of. By many, the master of. The of the peak. I think so, said the peak master of Qingrong. Yuan Qijing remained silent. The crowd felt more relaxed. On Liangwang Peak, one could learn all the sword styles of other peaks. As for what Yuan Qijing said about Zhao Leu not inheriting the sword, Guqing had already learned the 6-dragon sword style of Shuriwe Peak in secret during the period of sword washing, so there was nothing to worry about. Besides the Guochang Temple, Shui Nunnery, and the Platonist sect, there were some special guests who came to Aoyama to attend the ceremony. 2 princes from Zhaoga City. They were powerful figures in the mortal world, but they had to keep a low profile in a place like the Aoyama sect, which was a place for cultivation outside of the mortal world. The 2 of them had remained silent since the beginning, with a reserved smile on their faces. But for some reason, they suddenly stood up and praised the decision of the Aoyama sect and the courage of Zhao Leu. Nobody understood why the 2 princes did so. Normally, they should feel that the Aoyama sect was hypocritical in doing so. Even if they didn't point it out, they had no reason to praise it. Zhao Leu walked back to the green rock from the stream and sat down. She had been standing since the beginning of the inherited sword competition, not sitting down once. Her expression didn't show anything unusual, but Jingjiu noticed that her temples were slightly wet, indicating that she was still in an excited mood. Do you want to climb that mountain so badly? He asked. Zhao Leu didn't say anything. After Liangwang Peak took Guqing as their disciple, the rest of the disciples had their own places to go. The elder of Shuriwe Peak in charge of the inherited sword competition looked at Jingjiu and asked, Have you made up your mind? Many people now remembered that this youth in white who had shocked the whole crowd hadn't made his choice yet. Zhao Leu's choice was so shocking that some people even forgot about it. They didn't expect a new shock to follow. I made up my mind, said Jingjiu. I also choose Shinma Peak. The cliffs fell silent again, and then there was an uproar. Shuiyong opened his mouth, but couldn't utter a word. Young sister Yushan looked at Jingjiu with her hands cupping her face, as if she was intoxicated by him. Zhao Liu was startled, looking at Jingjiu's face, feeling more and more unable to understand this guy. Jingjiu also chose Shima Peak. The crowd was shocked, wondering what was going on today. In the twilight, Shima Peak was facing the setting sun. The clouds and fog were very thin, almost non-existent. The forest and sceneries in the mountain were very clear, and everything looked normal. There were several mountain paths leading to the peak top. It looked dangerous to cross the cliffs, but it wasn't difficult for the cultivation practitioners. These were merely illusions. After the ascension of the immortal Jingyang, Shenma Peak was sealed off. Unless the great formation of Aoyama opened a new sword source, there was no way to open it, let alone enter it. Zhao Liu had almost no chance of succeeding in inheriting the sword at Shenma Peak. The elder of Shuriwei Peak said, "As long as you can climb to the peak top and find the thoughtless sword, you will be recognized as the inheritor of the immortal Jingyang." Zhao Liu nodded. Guananshan said, "Young sister, if you have any problems, just step back. Don't be reluctant. You don't have to be so stubborn. Just be careful," said Guhan while looking at her. Zhao Liu said to Guananshan, "Thank you for what you said earlier, big brother. Even if I fail, I won't go to Liangwang Peak." "I'm sorry." What Guananshan said just now was to leave a way out for her, and it was approved by the sect master. As for the danger, with the sect master and so many highly achieved swordsmen of the Aoyama sect watching in person, Zhao Liu wouldn't die here, no matter how powerful the forbidding formation left by the senior Grandmaster Jingyang was. "In fact, you might die." Jingjiu said this sincerely, lifting his head to look at the quiet green peak in the twilight. It was too quiet on Shenma Peak, and the scenery was too clear. No sound could be heard on the strange cliffs or in the dense forest, as if they were all fake. Such silence usually signified true danger. "I have to go up there and have a look." "But you—" Zhao Liu glanced at him and said, "Since it's so dangerous, you don't have to follow me." Jingjiu said, "You think too much. I'm just curious about what's up there. It'll save me some energy if someone clears the way in front." Zhao Liu wasn't in the mood to think whether he was telling the truth or not, so she said, "Then you have to follow me closely." "Jingjiu, be careful, be careful," Elder Mo Chi said nervously, rubbing his hands. Jingjiu nodded and looked at the person beside him. Lu Shui stood there, worry written all over his small face. When Jingjiu looked at him, Lu Shui pulled a long face, which looked kind of cute. Jingjiu turned around and walked toward the peak with Zhao Liu. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.